Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to a brand new crash course. In this crash course we will learn about everything you need to know to get started with GraphQL, and you absolutely need zero experience to start off with, and by the end of it you will have a great depth of understanding of what GraphQL is and how to use GraphQL. Now, as you know, I like to teach things by building real applications. So before we dive into what GraphQL is and actually coding GraphQL, let's just quickly discuss the application that we are going to build. So before we get to that, I just want to show you a picture of my wonderful pet cat. So this is Felix, and he's a sweetheart, but sometimes he tells me that I'm a boring asshole. You know, all I do is code all day and I don't give him as much attention. So what he requested was, well, you know what, I need to give him a companion. So I was like, okay, you know what, I'm gonna get you another animal so you can hang out with. Now, what do you do when you want things? Well, you go on Amazon, of course. So that's exactly what I did. I went on Amazon and then I searched for basically an animal that I thought would be best suited, you know, in this small studio with my pet Felix. So I was like, okay, maybe I can get like a baby rhino. And I went ahead and I searched for rhino, and I saw that there is no real rhinos around. So I was like, okay, these are all toy rhinos, but I want a real rhino. And I couldn't find anything on Amazon. So what I decided to do was like, okay, maybe they're out of stock. So I was like, let me get another animal. Maybe I can get a tiger. And similarly, same exact thing. I saw no tigers, no real tigers per se. I saw toys, but you know, this won't satisfy my wonderful pet Felix. So I was like, okay, this is odd. And then after a few more searches, I noticed that, well, Amazon actually doesn't do this 2-day shipping with real animals. They can't just box them up and, you know, deliver them in 2 days. And I thought, you know what, this is actually a need in the market. We actually need this. And, you know, when there is a need as a software developer and, you know, the person with an entrepreneurial spirit, I actually went ahead and built out an application. So I called this application Animazon. And so you can get basically all of the perks that you get from Amazon, you know, 2-day shipping, Prime, but with real life animals. So essentially what we can do here is I have this application. Let's say you're interested in this salamander. Well, you can click on this salamander and you can basically add or buy them to the cart. And essentially we would just put them in a box and we would ship them to you in 2 days. This is the purpose of this application. Now, this application is a full stack application. It is built with React in the front end, and it is also built with GraphQL in the back end. We will not be working much in the React side. I actually built out this template I built it out for you guys, and essentially all we're going to be doing is we're going to be dealing with creating the backend GraphQL server in order to kind of transfer data between the front end and the back end. So that is primarily what we are going to be doing, but this is the application. And again, I always like to build real life usable applications, and I think this would really suit well. So again, you can go over here. We have this kind of cool header. And we can also like search animals by categories. So let's say we want mammals. Well, we can see all the mammals that we need. So we can do that. And then we can also, of course, you know, look for specific animals like so. So this is the application that we are going to build. And I will see you guys in the next section. Okay, so before we get started, I am going to mention my GitHub page. Now, if you want to follow along, which I highly suggest, and build out this application with me using GraphQL, I highly suggest going to my GitHub page at Harblade7 and then at this specific repo, GraphQL Crash Course. At the time of recording, it is private, but it will be public once the video is published. So over here, you will see 2 directories. Over here, we have the final directory, and this basically contains all of the code that essentially builds out this application. So this is the final code once we are done with it. It includes the client, which is the kind of the React side. Again, we're not going to be dealing with the React side as much, but mainly we're going to be dealing with the server, which involves basically all of the GraphQL code. Now, if you want to start off, you're going to use the starts directory. And if you actually open this up, then all you actually see is the client, and this is basically just contains this template over here, and we are going to create the server from scratch. So that's essentially what we are going to do, and then we're going to have these two talk to each other. So if you're interested in following along, go ahead and either clone this repository or fork it onto your own. So this is the repo right here, and this is the URL. So I highly suggest to clone it if you want to follow along. Alright, so let's discuss what is GraphQL. Now GraphQL is a query language, and that's actually what the QL over here stands for. So what is a query language? Well, it is a way to communicate with our API and get some data. We are querying for some data. So essentially we use GraphQL to communicate between our client and our API and eventually our database to get some specific data. For instance, if we go to our wonderful Animazon website, let's say we want to render these 3 cards over here. Well, as you can imagine, in these cards, there's pieces of information that we have to obtain from our server and our database, such as the titles over here and the images. So essentially what we would do is we would query for that data using GraphQL. So we would have some sort of query, and the query would ultimately look a little something like this. So we would query for it, our client will ask for that data, and then our server will understand GraphQL and return back the data that we want. So that right there is essentially what GraphQL's purpose is. Now you can imagine, okay, well, I kind of know something that already does this, a RESTful API. I hit a particular endpoint and I receive data, and I can render that data inside of our client. Now, what is the point of GraphQL? And to kind of illustrate this, let's look at a few diagrams. So over here, we basically have a typical REST application. So let's say we want to render all of these cards right over here. So basically all of the animals inside of our application, we want to fetch them so we can render these cards. Now, as you can imagine, there's specific pieces of information that we need to get, such as the image. We also need to get the titles, the price, the ratings and things of that nature for these particular animals. Now, in a RESTful approach, if we wanted to accomplish this, we would hit a particular endpoint that we have created. For instance, over here I have my REST API /animals. So this is the endpoint, and this will give us an array of objects, and essentially it's going to contain all of the information associated with the animal entity. So over here we have the title, we have the ID, we have the price, the description, the stock, the type, the rating, the sale, and the image. And this is great. Now we can actually use this information to render these multiple cards. However, there's a little bit of a problem with this approach, and the problem with this approach is we're getting back a bunch of data that we're ultimately not going to use. Granted, yes, we are going to use the title, we will be using the price, we will be using the image and the rating, but everything else we're really not going to be using. For instance, we're not using the description. In the cards over here, there's nothing about a description. Similarly, over here, there's nothing about sales, there's nothing about the type, there's nothing about the stock. So there's absolutely nothing that we need in regards to those columns. There's only a few specific columns that we want. Now let's actually look at another example where we want to just query for one specific animal. So for instance, let's say a user decides to click on the lion over here, and he gets a bunch of this information. So over here we have basically the description, we have the stock, we have the image. So then to do this in a RESTful approach, we actually have to hit another endpoint. So this is going to be the /animal endpoint, and then we can basically put the ID of that particular animal that we want to look for, basically either as a query string, or we can put it in the rec.body. But then we face the exact same issue. This time we're not getting an array, this time we're only getting that one object, but we're also getting all of the columns, and we might not need some of these columns. For instance, we might not need the sales column. So if we go back over here, there's nothing really associated with sales in this particular page over here. So we might not need this column, whereas maybe the other ones we do need. So this is kind of a problem that we actually face constantly with a RESTful approach. And this is actually known as overfetching. This is overfetching our data. Now, how can GraphQL solve this? Well, with GraphQL, we don't have multiple endpoints. We only have one endpoint. This is the only endpoint that we have right here, just one endpoint. And then from this endpoint, we use the GraphQL query language to select whatever data that we want. So again, we don't hit specific endpoints. We have one endpoint, and then we use specific, the GraphQL query language to hit whatever data that we want. And this is basically what it would look like. It would look something like this. And if this doesn't seem familiar to you, don't worry, we're going to cover it in great detail in this crash course. So we are basically going to query for whatever we need. So over here, we're saying, okay, well, we want the animals. And then from the animals, I want the title, the rating, the image, and the price, because that is exactly what we need essentially for the cards that we want to display over here. And as you can see, that's exactly what we get. We get an array of objects. And essentially, this array of objects only contains the title, the price, the rating, and the image. And so this is far better than this over here, because we are exactly fetching what we want. We are not overfetching anything. And as you can imagine with larger applications, when our entities get very, very large and complex and there's multiple columns, it kind of gets overwhelming to continuously fetch for everything, even though you might need a very limited amount for particular parts of your client application. So this right here is what GraphQL is ultimately trying to solve. Another thing that GraphQL solves, so GraphQL solves overfetching, but it also solves underfetching. Let's say, for instance, over here, let's look at our landing page as a whole. Let's look at this white part. Over here, we have the categories section right over here, and then we have the cards section. So essentially, to get the category, we need to get all of the categories, and we also need to get all of the cards, all of the animal cards. Now, to do this in a RESTful approach, we actually have to hit two different endpoints. We have to hit the animals endpoint, and then we also have to hit the categories endpoint. So for any one particular endpoint, we're actually underfetching all of the data that we need. Because if we only hit this endpoint, well, we're not getting any information about the categories. And if we only hit this endpoint, then we don't get any information about the animals. So we actually have to hit two endpoints to get the data that we want. Well, that is not a problem with GraphQL. We can actually just make one call, and we can say, well, I want the animals with these particular columns, and then the categories entity with these particular columns. And that way we can basically get all our data back. Essentially, we're going to get an array of two objects, one with animals and then one with categories. And essentially, we will be able to render this right over here. And I actually kind of showcase this over here. So this is the exact same query. Let's say we want to get the title, and then over here, similarly with the categories, we want to get, let's say, the category itself. So if we execute this, you can see we get back an array of all the animals, and then we get back an array of all the categories. And this is great because, well, we only had to make one call. And so this right here is a lot better, because with one particular call, we are not underfetching all of the data that we need. So this is a lot better. And these are some of the perks of GraphQL over a RESTful approach. And we're going to see much more perks as we kind of continue with the crash course, but these are the ones that I wanted to highlight. So I hope that kind of enlightens you and gets you excited, and I'll see you guys in the next section. Okay, so in this section, we are going to discuss some of the GraphQL terminologies that you probably won't see in a typical REST application. So we are going to just quickly discuss these terminologies, understand what they are, understand what they do, and then we will go ahead and actually create our GraphQL API in the next few sections. So the two main terminologies that I want to discuss are the ones right over here: schema and resolvers. And so let's begin with schema. So you can probably imagine what schema means. In GraphQL, we have to identify exactly how our data is going to look. So whatever entity we have in our application, we have to describe all of the columns and the data types associated to that entity. And we do this inside of, well, what is known as a schema. And essentially, for each entity inside of the schema, we call that a type definition, telling us this is the data that is associated with a particular entity in our application. So, for example, let's say we had a person entity or a people entity, and essentially we had that inside of our application, and we were using a GraphQL API. Well, in our schema, we would have this type definition right over here, something that looks like this, and it describes essentially the data associated to this entity. So we say, okay, well, we have type person, and then we can say, well, there is an ID, over here is the column, and then we specify the type of that particular column. Now in GraphQL, there's a special type for unique identifiers known as ID, and so we can say ID. But over here, there's other things like name, email. Over here, the type is string. So the type is string, which is known throughout multiple programming languages and frameworks. Over here, we have age, which has a type of integer. And then we have a phone, which is a type of string. And then we have gender, which is a type of Boolean. Say true is male, false is female. So this is what we actually have to do. We have to describe our data in a GraphQL API. And this is because, well, once we actually querying for our data, GraphQL needs to know, what you can actually query for and what you should expect to get out of it. So if we write our type definitions and then we query for, let's say, a house address, GraphQL is going to say, hey, no, that's not in our schema. It's not in our person type definition, so that's something that you can't query for. Similarly, let's say you query for email and then you get a number back. GraphQL is also going to say, hey, no, you can't do that. You're only going to get a string back. So in GraphQL, we have to define the type definitions of every single entity. So essentially, a schema is for us to define how our data will look. Now, the data that we actually get back is dependent on the resolvers. And the resolvers are essentially functions, so over here, this is the resolver, that return data that follow this schema. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to follow the schema, but if it doesn't follow the schema, it is going to trigger an error if we try to query for something that isn't in this particular schema. So, well, best practice is to have your resolvers follow the schema. It's not even actually best practice, it's pretty much required because you can't query for something that's outside of this schema. But as you can see here, over here we have a people resolver that returns an array of people, and essentially you can see here we have an ID of 1, which is a unique identifier, and the ID type over here, we'll talk about that a little bit later, and we'll talk about the exclamation marks a little bit later as well. But essentially the ID identifier ultimately translates to a string. And then over here we have string for name and email, and then we have the age, we have the phone number, and then we have the gender. So there we go. These are the two main terminologies that we have to discuss before kind of diving deep into creating our API. Remember, a schema is to define our data, the resolvers is to actually send out the data that we ultimately want. And the resolvers are going to basically be confined by the types in this schema. So those are the two definitions. I hope that makes sense. Let's actually go ahead and create our server. So let's go ahead and build out our GraphQL API. Now before we do this, let's go to the official GraphQL webpage at graphql.org and let's click on code. Once we click on code, we can actually see all of the languages that GraphQL supports. So we can essentially create a GraphQL API by using any one of these languages. So we're not actually constricted to one particular language. So for instance, we can write a GraphQL API using JavaScript or particularly Node. And over here we can use Go or PHP or Python or Java or Ruby, whatever you're comfortable with, GraphQL probably supports it. Now in this case, we are going to be primarily dealing with JavaScript. So we're going to create a JavaScript API, JavaScript GraphQL API, and then we're also going to be using JavaScript in the front end, of course. So let's actually go ahead and click on JavaScript. And then it prompts us to a page with a bunch of different packages that we can use to actually build out our GraphQL server. So as you can see here, this is the server section. To build out our GraphQL server, we can just use GraphQL.js, or we can use something called Apollo server, or we can use Express GraphQL or GraphQL Yoga or GraphQL Helix. Now, all of these might be a little bit different syntactically, but they ultimately really do the same thing. We're going to have a bunch of type definitions and schemas and a bunch of resolvers. For instance, over here you can just look at just the GraphQL.js. Over here we have a schema, and over here we have a resolver right over here. Similarly with Apollo server, we have a schema, we have a resolver. The syntax is just a little bit different, but really they kind of do the exact same thing. Over here, similarly, we have a schema, and over here we have a resolver. So really, if you master one, it's going to be really easy for you to master the other one. So don't be discouraged for the one that I pick, which is going to be Apollo server, because again, if you master Apollo server, it's going to be really easy for you to master the other ones. Now, why am I picking Apollo server? Well, it's because it is by far the most commonly used way of creating a GraphQL server. And so that's essentially what I'm going to use, and their syntax is great and very easy to understand. So we are going to be using Apollo server. Now, we also have to talk about how we can actually query for specific data in the front end. Now, to do this, we have to essentially use another library for the client. And there's a bunch of different libraries that we can use. We can use, GraphQL request, we can use Apollo client or relay or amplify or whatever it is. There's a bunch that we can use. Now, specifically, again, because we used Apollo for the server side, we are going to use Apollo client in the client side. And again, this is very, very easy, but if you know this, you're gonna know the other ones. So that's what I like about it. And again, the reason why I'm using Apollo client is, as you can see here, it is very, very popular. By far one of the most starred. I guess Relay is pretty popular too because this was built by Facebook. But you can see here, I mean, other than Relay, it's kind of miles ahead of all of the other frameworks. So we're going to be using Apollo client in the front end to fetch data, and our actual server is going to be used, or is going to be created with Apollo server. So that is what I am going to do. Now, if you are eventually going to build a GraphQL server with different languages, so maybe like Ruby, well, you would probably want to look at the different options. So over here we have like GraphQL Ruby, and then we have Ago. And then over here, for Rust, we have other kind of options. Similarly over here for the clients. And we can just kind of scroll through the different ones that you want to use. But again, for this particular crash course, we are mostly going to be dealing with JavaScript. Actually, we're only going to be dealing with JavaScript. And so we're only going to be looking at these particular frameworks, particularly the Apollo servers. So now that that is understandable, let's actually move on to the next section where we actually go ahead and code out our GraphQL Apollo server. Okay, so let's go on and build our Apollo server. Now, if you want to follow along, again, go to my GitHub page at this URL right over here, Hardblade7-GraphQL Crash Course, and clone this repo and go into the start directory. This is where we are going to be working with to create this wonderful application. Now, the start directory contains only the client currently, but we are going to add the server in this lecture actually. So we're going to add the server directory right over here. Similarly, if you also want to work, you will need a text editor. I am using VS Code. So if that's the one that's actually most popular and kind of standard in the industry, but you can go ahead and use whatever it is that you like. Again, I prefer VS Code. If you like VS Code, go ahead and download it. And lastly, we are going to be dealing with JavaScript and particularly Node in the backend. So you need to have Node installed. So to install Node, just click on Node, go to the official Node webpage and just click on the recommended for most users and just go through the simple installation process. Now you can tell if you have Node by going to any one of your terminals. I'm going to use the integrated terminal in VS Code, and you can just do simply Node version, and right here is telling me, okay, I got version 14, so I am all set. Now along with Node, you also get npm, which is Node Package Manager, which allows us to essentially install a bunch of packages, which we will, especially for, well, installing the Apollo server package. So that is basically the requirements, and now let's actually go ahead and create our Apollo GraphQL server. Now to do this, again, let's go to the start directory, and in here what we are going to do is we're going to create a brand new server directory, and then in here we are going to create an index.js. So an index.js. So that is the first step. The second step is to actually go to the start directory. So I'm moving into the start directory, and then I'm moving into the server inside of the start directory. Make sure you are moving into the server inside of the start directory and not the server inside of the final directory, because again, the final is done. So make sure it's in the start. And over here, we basically have to do just a little bit of kind of manual setup. So over here, we have to do npm init-y. And we're doing this basically just so we can get a package.json file inside of this directory, which basically allows us to install packages in this directory as well. So over here, this is just a typical package.json. We're also going to change the script over here to start. And then for the script that we are going to run, we're going to run nodemon index.js. Now, if we want to run our application, our index.js application, typically we would do something like, node index.js. For instance, let's do a quick console.log of hello. And then if you want to basically run this file, we would just, inside of this directory, you would just say node index.js. And as you can see here, we get hello. However, if I do end up changing this to, let's say, helloer, well, you can see here that we have to actually rerun the server. Now this kind of gets annoying. I don't want to rerun the server every single time. So what we can do instead is install a package called nodemon. So we can do something like npm install nodemon, and then with the -g flag, so we can install it globally inside of our machine. So now essentially what we can do, instead of something like node index.js, we can do nodemon index. And now if I go ahead and change this, so let's go ahead and change this. There we go. You can see here it's kind of live updates, which is great. So over here in our package.json, we're saying, okay, well, we can do nodemon index.js. So now, because we specified that in our package.json, we can do something like npm run start, and there we go. We get the same effect, and that's why we are using nodemon. All right, so that is the kind of the initial setup. Let's actually go ahead and create our Apollo server. So to do this, let's actually go to the official Apollo documentation. Let me zoom in a little bit. And let's go here with getting started with Apollo. So it says here the first thing that we have to do is, well, install these packages. Remember, we have to install the Apollo server package, and then we also have to install the GraphQL package. So let's actually go about installing these ones. So let's go over here and let's do npm install Apollo server, and then also GraphQL, which is a package that is needed, well, to create our GraphQL API. So let's go ahead and install this. And then over here it's saying create an index.js file. We've already done this, which is great. And over here you can see a little bit of boilerplate. So you can see here, once the index is kind of done, this is what we are going to need. So over here, we are defining some type definitions, and then over here, these are some of the data associated with our type definitions. And then over here, we have a resolver. Let's actually kind of copy and paste all of these, and then we will discuss them kind of in detail, and then we're going to refactor our whole application so we can actually build Animazon, which is basically what we want. So the first thing that it's saying is we need to get basically this over here. So we need to get Apollo server and GraphQL from Apollo server, and we should be able to get this because, well, we installed Apollo server. To double check, you can just do Apollo. Let's see, it should autofill Apollo server, and it does autofill. And you can even do Apollo server and then GraphQL over here. You can see that. Now again, I'll discuss these in a lot of detail, so don't too worry, but for now we're just going to do a little bit of copy and pasting. So the next step over here, we have our type definitions. So over here, we are creating our type definitions. Let's get rid of these comments. So over here, we have some type definitions. So you can see here we have the book type definition that has a title and a string, and an author that is a string. And over here, we have this weird type definition called query, and it seems to be an array of books. Don't worry all too much about it. We will discuss that in detail in the next sections. But as you can see here, this is basically what this GraphQL or GQL tag is doing. We use this to create our type definitions. So basically, we create our type definitions by specifying GQL, and then we use template literals, and then inside of here we have our type definitions. Now for you, if you copy and paste this, and this is the first time that you use GraphQL, this might not look all too nice for you syntactically. Now it looks nice for me syntactically because I actually have an extension, a GraphQL extension. So you can actually go ahead and install this extension right over here, and this just allows us to have nice syntax highlighting. So go ahead and do that. So there we go. So over here we have defined our type definition, which is great. So what is the next step? Well, the next step, we need some data that basically follows this type definition. So we can say, okay, well, here's this data. This data at the moment is basically stored in our application as an array, but this could come from a database, and primarily it would come from a database. But again, it would have to follow this schema right over here with title, that is a string, and author, that is also a string. So there we go. That is the first step. So now we have our type definitions, our schemas right over here. We have our actual data that follows the schema. And then the next step is we need to define our resolvers. So let's actually go ahead and copy this. Again, if I am going too fast, this is just quick, like little setup. I'm going to go in great detail with every single thing in great detail. So don't worry all too much. So over here we have our resolver. And essentially what this is doing is basically resolving this books query. So essentially here we're defining how our queries are going to look like, because we actually have to define those queries and define what we are getting back. So essentially this is what this type query is. So we're saying is, okay, well, we can actually ask for books, and this is going to return an array of book. And book basically is something that follows this structure over here. So an array of objects where we have a title that is a string, and then the author that is also a string. So now, in our resolvers, we are essentially resolving for this. We're saying, okay, well, in this basically query definition, we have this thing called books, and we are going to return, over here, this is a function, books, this books right over here. So we're basically saying that we are going to return this array of objects that follows this type definition right over here. Okay, so that is that step. And then we need to create an instance of our Apollo server. So let's actually go ahead and just quickly copy this. And then let's paste that in. And so over here, we are creating an instance of our Apollo server. And in here, we are defining our type definitions. So over here, our type definitions, and we're also defining our resolvers. So over here, we have all of our resolvers. And then we are just doing a typical server.listen, essentially just launching our application. So there we go. We have created our first GraphQL API. So now what we can do is we can do something like npm run start. And there we go. We are now listening on port 4000. So if we go to 4000, so we can go to localhost 4000, we get this kind of interface right over here. And this might be a little bit strange for you. This is known as the GraphQL playground. So essentially we can use this to kind of query for data like we would query for data in the client. Again, if this is kind of just boggling your mind, what is going on here, don't worry, we're going to go through everything in great detail. This is just a quick introduction, a quick boilerplate that we need to get done to kind of continue this crash course. So now what we can do here is basically we can query for data. And particularly, well, we only have books that we can really query for. So over here, we're saying that we can query for books. So what we will do is we'll say, well, we want to query, and then in an object, we say all the things that we want to query for. Again, we only have the options of books. And as you can see here, it's self-documenting. So we can say books. And then we can say the things that we want from books. So we want the title, and we also want the author. And then there we go. We get an array of books. And that is basically our GraphQL server. That's essentially what we're doing. Now, if we don't want to, if we don't want authors, we can go ahead and just say title, and there we go. We have title, so we can specifically look for exactly what we want. Now, let's say we just do books on its own. Well, this fails because for something that is defined in our type definition, we actually have to specify no matter what it is that we want. So we actually have to define that, hey, we want author and title, and there we go. So that is essentially our first GraphQL API. So if you successfully got this to run, there you go. You created your first API. Congratulations. Now in the next section, we're actually going to be modifying this API to create this kind of header right over here. Let's actually zoom out a little bit. So we're going to start off a little bit easy. So we're just going to essentially have our data in our API, and we are going to basically want to fetch it into this header. So this is basically what we are going to do. So we're going to basically be doing quite a bit of modification and talk about each step in a lot of detail. So I'll see you then. Okay, so now that we have built out our boilerplate for our GraphQL Apollo server, let's go ahead and modify it a little bit and kind of add our own types. So over here, what we were going to want to do is we were going to want to work on this section right over here, just this hero section. This right here will always keep the same, but let's say we want to kind of dynamically add this data in, and therefore we want to get that from our GraphQL API. So essentially we have to create some sort of way to get data associated to these cards. Now, what are the data associated with these cards? Well, we have a title over here. So we have a title, and we also have an image, and that pretty much seems like it's it. So those are the two pieces of information that we need to get from our GraphQL API to render these cards. Now, what we have to do now is actually define the type of data inside of our GraphQL API using the type definitions. So this is the very first step, is defining how the data is going to look like for this entity right over here. So let's actually go about doing that. So again, inside of our type definitions, we are going to add another type, another entity that we are going to use to describe how the data is going to look. So over here, we can add another type, and we're going to call this main card. And then we're going to have curly braces, and then in here, we are going to define the columns and their associated data types. So let's go ahead and do that. So over here, if you go back to our application, remember we have a title that is going to be a string, and we also have an image that is going to be a string as well, some sort of URL. So let's go ahead over here and let's say title, and then we're going to say, well, this is going to be a string. And then we're going to say, well, we want an image. Similarly, this is also going to be a string. So right now, what we did was we defined our type, but really we're not doing anything with it. Now, one thing that I want to note is once we we can define things other than string. We can define things like, let's say, I don't know, maybe if we need the age, well, this could be an integer. So this is a number. Similarly, we can also have something like float. So this is a number with a decimal point, whereas integer, we don't have decimal points. And then you can have something like, let's just do here. We'll remove this a little bit later. This is a float. This is a number. And then we can also have other ones like, let's say, booleans. So booleans either true or false. So over here, these make up scalar types. So essentially a string, a float, an integer, and a boolean is known as scalar types. Whereas when you're actually referring to another type, for instance, this main card can actually refer to another type, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Just like really this books right here is referring to an array of this type, this is not a scalar type. This is actually referring to a interface itself. So right here, we are defining scalar types, just a little bit of terminology. So let's actually get rid of these. So right now, again, we are just defining how this data is going to look. The next step is to actually define, once we want to query our data, how the data is going to look once we get it back. Well, over here, what we would do, we would say something like main cards, and then we would say, okay, well, we expect to get back an array. So an array, not just one, but multiple. And that's because we have 3 over here. We could have more, multiple of this main card type. So essentially here we're saying that, okay, if we query for main cards, what we expect is an array of objects that contain title, that is a string, and image, that is a string. Now, if you go ahead and save this, we can see here that it works perfectly fine. So let's actually go about and query for this. So now let's do a quick refresh of our server. And then we want to say query, and then go ahead and query. Now, if we we can also leave off the query, and then it will be an implied query. But you know what? Let's actually add the query just for the sake of just clarity. So now we can say main cards. Awesome. And then within our main cards, we can ask for what we want. We can ask for the title, and then we can also ask for the image. Now, if we execute this, we get null back. And the reason for this is because we don't have a resolver that is returning any data that follows this kind of constriction right over here, this data type. So let's actually create that right now. So let's kind of copy what the book have over here. And we're just going to say main cards. So main cards. This is basically the data. Now, this data would ultimately come from our database. Our resolver will probably be making some sort of request to our database to get this data, and then it would send it off. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to leave it over here as an array. Now let's go ahead and let's say that, oops, why is this 4? This is odd. Let's just say the title of this book is, let's say, I'm trying to think of a quick book. I don't even know who this author is. I'm trying to think of a book. Let me look at my book collection. Let's do Blink. Let's go Blink. That's a good book. All right. So over here we have some books. I don't know why I spent so much time thinking about a book. We're gonna delete that section anyways. So let's say over here. Well, okay. So let's actually add our data in here. So we got our recently reviewed. And then let's say we have an image of a lion. So this is, let's say, our URL for this particular image. Then we have looking for a gift. And then we have over here an image of penguin. And let's remove this from author to penguin. And then lastly, what we are going to do is we are going to, let's just clean this up a little bit. We're gonna add the last one. I believe the image is a cat, and the title is best behaved. So now we can just add that in there. Awesome possum. And so now in our resolver, so we go into the query. So essentially now what we want to do is we want to resolve basically this query right here, how this is going to look like. We want to resolve this query. So we can go into basically the query section, and then we can say, well, okay, so main cards, and then that is going to resolve to this data right over here. So essentially what we're saying is, okay, this is how it should look like. Again, the type definition is just describing how our data should look like. So how the main card should look like, how the types should look like, and how our queries should look like. So we should be able to query for books and get back an array of basically objects that contain title and authors. Similarly here, we should be able to query for main cards, and get back an array of objects with title and image. However, this is just defining how it should look. This is very, very important. This is just defining how our data should look. The resolvers itself are the ones that kind of resolve what the actual data is going to be. So over here, we're saying that, okay, well, we want to resolve this main cards over here, this main cards query, and we are going to return back, this array of objects right over here. Let me actually zoom out a little bit, might be a little bit easier to see. So again, we want to basically resolve the main cards and return back this array of objects. And resolvers are functions because, we might be actually doing some complex logic in here, such as, asking for data from a database and things of that nature. We might want to do validation and things of that nature. So that is basically that. So now once we save this, let's go ahead and go to GraphQL Playground. And now if I execute this exact same query, there we go, we get our data. Now if I were to remove image, there we go, we get only titles. And that is basically the power of GraphQL. You can really fine tune the things that you want. You're not kind of constricted to getting everything back, even though you might not need these things. So that's kind of the power of GraphQL, and that's why it's something that I always use in all of my projects. Alright, so that is pretty much it. But one thing I want to discuss is, let's say that for some reason, our image is undefined. One of the images is undefined, and so it basically returns back a null. Now if we were to execute this, you can see here that it is totally okay with it, even though over here we have not defined anything about it being null, right? We're saying that, okay, the string can be, the image can be a string, the title can be a string, it can't be a number. So let's actually change this to a number. Let's see if that does anything. So if we save this and we change this to a number, I guess it returns the number of 4. Let's see if we change it to a boolean, it returns the boolean, the string of true. So it basically converts things to strings. However, with null, it's okay with it. It just returns null, even though right here we clearly defined that we want a string. Now by default, what happens is when we define our scalar types, or where we define any type for that matter, it could be either the thing that we've defined or it could be null. So that's exactly what's happening here. For instance, if we define something like, some sort of float, we're saying that, okay, this could be a float or it could be null. Now, if we want to basically specify that this absolutely cannot be null, what we would do is we would add an exclamation mark or a bang at the very end. So we're saying here, this absolutely cannot be null, it has to be a string. So now, if we go back to over here, we have null. Remember, when we previously executed this query, this was null. Now, if we were to execute this again, there we go, it says cannot return null for non-nullable field. So we get some sort of error. So we would actually have to go ahead and change this back to lion. And then if we execute this again, there we go. Awesome. So that is that. We have successfully done our first custom query. And I hope this really makes sense. Remember, type definitions define how our data would look, okay? And this type query is very, very special. The keyword is very special because it's just defining how we can query our data. So right over here, that's type query, and these are basically how our other data is going to look like. This right here is just our data. Again, this could come from a database. You know, our resolvers can have some sort of like complex logic in here. Maybe we can have something like, if we're using like a MongoDB database, it can be like something like main cards. You know, we can use some of the models, main cards.find. You know, we can have like a async, and then over here like await, blah blah blah. Let's see here, like let's say main card, and then, you know, dot find whatever this. We can say like, oh, we want to find them all, and then we can just say, well, we want to return the main card. You know, we can have some relatively complex logic and actually reaching out to the database. Instead, and again, in this crash course, I don't want to deal with actually working with the database. Instead, what we're going to do is just simply just have our thing stored in an array of objects. So over here, we're resolving it, and we're kind of resolving how our data is actually going to be. So there we go. We have resolvers, we have data, and we have type definitions, and we've basically successfully created this part over here. Later on, much later on in the crash course, we're actually going to go into the client and actually fetch the data, and it's going to be very similar to what we have over here, but you know, there's just a little bit of nuances. So now in the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to work on these cards over here, and this should be relatively similar to what we've done so far. And then later on, we're going to work on the category section, and this is where we're actually going to see some sort of relationships. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. Okay, so let's move on and let's work on the cards section right over here. Now this contains a lot more data, as you can imagine, and thus it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but it's really going to follow the exact same steps. So let's go about doing this right now. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to define how this entity is going to look. Now each card is describing a particular animal, so we're going to call our entity animal. Now before we do this, let's actually go ahead and remove anything related to books in our application. So let's remove the books array, let's remove the books query, and let's also remove the type definition in our books over here, and then we can remove this just because we don't need it anymore, and it just kind of adds a little bit more bloat into our application. So again, what we want to do is we want to add the type definitions for these particular animals. So let's go ahead over here, and we can do this anywhere, the order doesn't really matter, and we can say animal. And so now we have to define the types associated with an animal. Well, over here we have some sort of an image for each one. Okay, so we're going to say, well, we need an image, and we're going to say that this image is a string, and we're going to add a bank telling us that we absolutely need some sort of image and it cannot be nullable. The reason for this is, well, because we can't really showcase a project or a product or an animal in this case if we don't have an image. So there we go. We're going to say that this has to be provided as a string if we are going to provide it. So that's the first thing. Over here we have some sort of title. So let's go ahead over here and let's say title, and then this is also going to be a string, and we're going to say that this is non-nullable as well. Alright, so let's move on. Over here we have some sort of rating. Now for the sake of this application, just because it makes the front end a lot easier, we're going to assume all of them are 5-star ratings. So over here, all of them are 5-star ratings, so we're not really going to be dealing with that type of data. But let's actually add it in anyways. Let's actually add in rating, and then this is going to be a float because it can either be something like 4.5 or 5.0 and things of that nature. Now typically this will be something that we absolutely need in our application. You know, for a real application like Amazon, they actually want to showcase a rating, so this shouldn't be a nullable field. However, because our application, all of our wonderful animals are 5-star rated, we're just going to leave it without the bang. Alright, so without that exclamation mark saying that, hey, this could be nullable. But over here, this is another scalar type that we can use. Alright, so let's move on. The price. So the price itself could also be a float or some sort of numeric. But what we're going to do is we're going to have it be a string, just so we can add basically this wonderful comma wherever we want very, very easily. So we're going to say the price the string. And also typically once we're working with Stripe, actually the price is kind of given to Stripe as a string, but that's just another topic for another day. There we go. We're going to say that the price is a string and it should not be nullable. That's why we added the bang at the very end. Over here, we're going to say, over here we have some sort of like delivery date. Now this is not a big deal. We're just going to leave this whatever as it is. So we're not going to actually include this in our database. But we could if we wanted to add some sort of string, but I'm not going to do that just for the sake of simplicity. So this is just going to be static no matter what. It's going to be free delivery by Tuesday, February 16th. Now, once we click on a particular animal, let's say we click on the lion, there's actually more data associated with it. Over here, we have some sort of a description. So over here, we have a description. Over here, let's see. I don't know if we have anything else. It seems as though this is what we have. So over here, we can say that we have a description. So description, and we can say that this description is a string. However, if you look at it, this description contains multiple points right over here. So we have a point over here, a point over here, a point over here, and a point over here. So it seems like it is kind of an array of descriptions. And so what we can do is we can define this by saying that, well, okay, this is an array of strings. Now we can say that this is absolutely required by adding an exclamation mark. So, without the exclamation mark, it could be an array of strings or it could be a nullable value. But by adding the bang at the very end, we're saying that, okay, this absolutely has to be an array of strings and not nullable. Now inside of the array, we could have strings or null values. So over here we can say that, okay, if there's an element inside of this array, this absolutely has to be a string, and we can kind of specify that with another bang inside of this array. So over here we're saying that over here we absolutely need an array of strings, and then over here with this bang we're saying that, okay, inside of the array it cannot be nullable, it has to be string, so there should be no value that is null. There we go. We have basically defined our animals. The one thing that we are missing is we're missing this over here, which is the stock. So we can say something like let's do stock, and this is going to be an int. Let's say this is also non-nullable, and let's also add a Boolean type. So let's say something like on sale. We're just going to say this is a Boolean, and this is not required. Okay, we're just going to say this could be a nullable value if we wanted to. So there we go. We have defined our animal type. So now, okay, what's the next step? Let's go ahead and save this. Nothing seems to break. So now let's go ahead and let's actually add that basically type definition in our query. So because right now, if we actually go to our query and we go ahead and try to query for some sort of animal. So let's go, animal, we actually don't see it. We can actually look at the docs right here. We can see here that we can only query for main cards. And that's because we haven't described how our query type definitions are going to look like. So now we can say something like, okay, well, we can query for animals, and that should return an array of the type animal. So again, it should return an array of objects with these particular types. And so if we go ahead and we save this, now if we refresh and we look at our documentation, we can see here that we can actually query for animals as well. So now we can say we can query for animals, and then we can get their description, we can get their price. However, once we execute this, you can see here we get null. Now, the reason for this is because, well, we don't have any value associated with this. Now, we can also kind of trigger the error by saying, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So that's basically saying that, hey, we shouldn't get null. So we can basically trigger some sort of error. Now, if we execute this, we can see cannot read null for non-nullable values. All right, so let's actually go about creating basically the data associated with our query. Now, one thing that's happening here is this kind of is getting a little bit messy. So let's actually move our data into a separate file. So let's go ahead and inside of our server in the start directory, let's create a db.js file. And essentially all we're going to do is we are going to just cut our data. We're just going to paste it in there. And then we are going to do something over here. We're going to do const animals. And then we're going to say, let's copy paste basically this right over here, because this is exactly how it's going to look like. So we're just going to copy that. And let's just say image of lion. And then let's just copy this. Later on, I guess this is a little bit more difficult. Let's just add dummy ones. Later on, I'm just going to copy and paste the exact data from our GitHub page. So let's go here. Let's just add something dummy right over here. This is an array of strings. Let's add a comma, and this is some number, and this is true. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we're just simply going to do a module.exports, and we're going to export these data types right over here. So we're going to export these ones right here. And so once we save this, we can actually import this into our application. So we can say something like, we do something like const, and we can import from our database file. We can get the main cards, and we also can get the animals. And there we go. Basically now we have a separate file to define our data. There we go. So now essentially everything should be working as working perfectly once we save this, because now we still have our main cards. Now in our resolvers, we can say that, okay, to resolve this particular query, this particular query, we can say that, animals, essentially, this is the function and it returns animals. And remember, animals is coming from our database. So if we go ahead and save this, everything still works perfectly fine. And then what we can do now is we can go ahead and we can actually query for animals at this point. So now if I were to execute this exact same command, you can see here that I get this data. So that is pretty awesome. And we can actually, really selectively ask for what we want. So we can ask for stock, title, whatever it is that we want. And there we go. So that is awesome. Like this is really awesome. This allows us to basically get all of the data associated with all of the animal data in our application, so we can render these basically cards over here. However, there's a little bit of a problem. What if somebody clicks on a particular card? So they click on this card, and now we don't want to render all of the data associated with all animals. We just want to render the data associated with this one particular animal. So how do we go about doing that? That gets a little tricky. So we're going to actually look into that in the next section. Okay, so the next step is to create some sort of resolver that only returns one animal. So right now we have a resolver that returns all the animals in our database. So basically it's going to contain, over here we have, so the next step is to create a resolver that only returns one particular animal based on some sort of unique identifier. So that when we click on an animal, we only get the data associated with that particular animal. Right now, we have a resolver that returns all of the animals in our database. Remember, this is all of the animals. Currently, there's only one object, but let's actually quickly fix that at the moment. Let's go ahead, and let's move back over here. Let's go ahead and go to my GitHub page, and then go to, again, this particular URL, or if you cloned it, all you have to do is go to the final directory, the server directory, and then the db.js. And over here you can see that we have the animals. Let me quickly zoom in. So we have the animals array with just a bunch more data. So go all the way down until we find the closing bracket of this array and just copy everything right in. and right in and just copy that instead of this right over here. So now if we go ahead and save this, now we are returning every single kind of element inside of our array, because this is exactly what this resolver is doing, is returning every object, every single animal inside of our database. And this is going to be our database for just the time being. So now if we go ahead and query for this, you can see here we get a bunch of data. Let's get rid of the description because that's just a little bit bulky. Let's just do something like, I don't know, the title. And then we can see here that we get every single animal inside of our database. So this is not what we want when someone clicks on a particular card. We actually only want to return this object right over here. So we probably just want to return the first one right here. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we're going to have to create another resolver, and this resolver is only going to return just one animal. So let's go ahead and let's think about how we are going to do this. Well, the first thing that we are going to do is we're probably going to have to, search through and iterate through this existing array and find that, okay, this is the object that we need to return. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, we're going to go about doing this by having some sort of unique identifier within each object. Now, this unique identifier could be an ID, or it could be something like a slug. A slug is basically the slash over here that we kind of append at the very end of our URL. And this basically identifies, I guess I can't zoom in, but this basically identifies that, okay, this is /line, this is referring to one particular product. Now this is going to be a unique identifier, and it should be unique across all of the products, all of the animals inside of our application. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to have basically a slug that is unique based on essentially whatever the animal is. So once we go to a particular animal in our React application, we are going to get this slug, and then we are going to query for the correct data based on this slug. So let's actually go about doing that right now in the backend. Now also, we should always have some sort of unique identifier, even though we might not use it eventually. Maybe later on we're going to use it. So we should always have some sort of unique identifier, and therefore we should actually change that in our schema. So let's go ahead and let's add a slug type and an ID type. So let's go ahead and let's go to our index.js in our server. And let's go here, let's make a few modifications. We're going to have an ID, and this is going to be of type ID. Now this ultimately is going to translate to a string, but this is just telling GraphQL that this is a unique identifier. Similarly, we're also going to have a slug, and the slug is going to be a type of string, and this is going to be has to be a string. It can't be a non-nullable value. So now if we go ahead and save this, we can actually go ahead and query for, well, slug, and we should be able to get our slugs. So over here you can see a slug of lion, slug of chameleon. So if we decide to click on like the dolphin, we should see /product/dolphin. That's essentially what this slug is saying. Alright, so now what we can do is, if we decide to go on like /lion, we can extract this slug and basically find the correct object based on whatever this slug is. So we can basically find this object. Now remember, look, all the slugs are unique. So let's go ahead and let's figure out how we can do this. Now to do this, we need a new way of querying our data. So let's go to our query. And we're going to say that, okay, well, we want to query not for animals this time, we want to query for an animal. So just one animal without the S at the very end. And this is going to just return one particular animal. And it's always going to return one particular animal. Actually, you know what? We're going to say that we're going to be like, okay, if you provide us with an invalid slug, we could possibly return null. So we're going to actually make this non-bangable. So this could be null as well. So basically, essentially what we have to do is we have to somehow provide that slug to this query. Now to do this, all we have to do is add parentheses right in front or right after the animal, and then in these parentheses, these are basically the arguments that we can define with this query. So we can say something like slug, and this is going to be some sort of string, and this is going to be required. If you want to query for an animal, you have to provide us with some sort of slug. So now if we go ahead and we save this, we can actually go to our playground, and we can see we can actually query for an animal. So we can actually query for an animal, and then we can ask for whatever it is that we want. Let's say we want the title. Okay, but then we also have to provide a slug right over here. So we can say something like lion. Now, right now we don't have a resolver, and that's why we are returning null. So let's actually go ahead and create the resolver that resolves the data for this particular query right over here. So now all we have to do is just create an animal resolver. And something that I haven't mentioned yet is that the parentheses, the function over here, actually takes a few arguments. So there's three main arguments. There's the parent argument, there is the args argument, and there is the context argument. Now we're going to talk about all three in great detail, but for now we're going to focus on the middle one. So let's go ahead and let's execute this, and let's just console.log the args. That's all we're going to do at this point. So once we execute animal, so once we basically execute this query, this resolver is going to run. Let me quickly just zoom in. So this resolver right here is going to run. So again, once we execute this right over here, the animal query, this resolver is going to run, and it's going to console.log the args. So we should be able to see it right over here inside of our terminal. So let's execute this. Again, we get null, and there we go. We actually see the args. And there we go. The args is a slug that is a lion. So we can actually use this to our advantage. Now what we could do is we could do something like this. We can do something like, okay, well, let animal, the animal that we want to return, and then we can basically iterate through the animals array. So remember this animals array. We can iterate through that with the find method. And essentially what the find method does is it finds the first thing that follows a kind of a specification that we set. So we can say for each animal, we're going to say, okay, if the animal.slug is equal to the args.slug. And so essentially this right here is going to find, so essentially what the find method is going to do is it's going to iterate through every single object in our array, in our animals array. And what it's going to do is it's going to compare the item that we're currently iterating over, its slug value, to the slug value inside of the arguments that we have over here. So its slug value of the item that we're currently iterating over, and then the slug value of the argument. So for instance, let's say that, let me just quickly walk you through this because maybe you guys don't come from a JavaScript background, but this is just literally a loop in kind of just the simplest case. It's really just a loop that we're doing. So let's just say I want to find chameleon. So let's go over here and let's say chameleon. And so what we would do here is we would iterate through the animals array. And so we would first begin with this right over here, and we would say, okay, well, is its slug value, which is lion, equal to the one that is equal to the args.slug? And remember, the args.slug is whatever that we pass in over here. So this is going to be an object of slug.chameleon. And so in this case, though, it's not. So it's going to move on to the next one. And in this case, well, its slug value is equal to the args.slug because we changed this to chameleon. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to return that particular object into this variable over here. And now all we have to do is simply just return that animal. And there we go. So we can just return that animal. And now what we can do is if we actually go ahead and execute this, we get cannot access animal before initialization. I wonder why that is. Let's see. Okay. That's because this is called animal. There's just a bunch of things that are called animals. This should also be called animals. So let's fix that. And then let's execute this. And then we get null for some reason, which is quite odd. I wasn't expecting that actually. Let's do just animal to be found. I don't know if that fixes things. Let's do animal to be found, and then over here animal to be found, or actually no, this should be just animal to be found. Okay, so I hope this fixes things, and it doesn't. Okay, so I wonder why that is. I might have to quickly be back and just check why this is failing. After a bunch of testing, I actually realized that I forgot the return right over here. So what I did was I just did that animal.slug is equal to animal.slug is equal to args.slug, but we should either return this, because this is going to return a true or false value. In most cases, it's going to return a false value, but once it returns true, that's when we want to actually return that particular animal. And that's why this was actually failing. So we can actually change this to something like animal instead of animal to be found, and this should work perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So just remember the return. I was my mind wasn't working for a second. But now if we were to execute this, you can see we actually get only that particular animal. Now if I were to change this to lion, we get, well, 70-year-old lion with whatever. We get whatever data that we want. But you can see here now, this is a great way to ask for exactly what we want. Now let's say, let's add some additional logic. And this is kind of the power of resolvers. You can really add whatever logic it is that you want. So let's say we add some sort of like gibberish, slug, and we get nothing back. Well, there we go. We can actually get null. So you know what? I was thinking that maybe we can add some logic that if it's undefined, then return null. But actually GraphQL, what it does is if it is undefined, then it just automatically converts it to null. So there we go. So that is basically that. That is how we can actually go ahead and query for only one specific animal. And that way we can actually append whatever slug that we want to do. So maybe we can append, we can append horse. So we can append horse, and there we go. We get our horse data. So now when we actually click on a particular animal, just like lion, let's say, we basically in our front end can get that slug, make that exact same query, and provide, that slug as the argument, which we can access right over here with the args in our resolvers. And then we can basically select for whatever it is that we want. So there we go. We actually did quite a bit of complex queries. So that pretty much concludes really everything that we need with our cards. Let's actually move on to the categories, which is going to kind of present a challenge of their own. So let's do that in the next section. Alright, so the next step is to work on the category page. And I actually mentioned that this is going to be a little bit more complicated than just the cards itself. And the reason for this is when we click on a particular category, we get triggered to this page over here, which shows basically all of the animals themselves that are associated with that category. So if we clicked on mammals, then we get all of the mammals only. So now you can see that there's actually going to be some sort of relationship between entities. The category entity is going to have to somehow map to a bunch of animal entities. And we're going to get to how we can do that a little bit later. But let's actually just go ahead and do kind of similarly what we've done with our animal entity, but with the category entities at the moment. So let's go over here. Let's go back to our server. Let's go to our index.js, and let's go and write another entity. So let's go ahead and let's say that we have a category entity. We're gonna say, well, we need an ID. We also are gonna need an image. We're gonna say that this is a string, of course. Remember, this is the image right here. And then we're going to say something like, well, okay, what category does this fall in? So that's going to be a string. And this is going to basically represent this right over here. And then let's also have a slug, because once we click on a particular category, you can see that it moves us to the products / whatever this slug is. So this is the mammal. So we're going to do a very similar thing with basically the two resolvers that we have over here. So let's say slug. And this is going to be a string, and I believe that is pretty much all that we need. All right, so that is that. Now let's go over here and let's basically add our, you know, let me zoom back out. So let's add our type definition for our queries. So now we're gonna call this categories. So let's say we want to get all of the categories. So we can say, well, this is going to be of an array that is a category. We're just gonna say that everything is non-nullable. All right, so this is awesome. This works perfectly fine. So now let's go ahead and let's create our resolver. Now the resolver is going to look very similar, or if not identical, to line 41, so for this one right here. So let's go ahead and let's do a categories resolver. And this resolver is simply going to return an array of categories. Now we haven't defined an array of categories, so let's go to our database. And let's go at the very bottom. Let's actually manually write this out. So we're just going to do const categories. And then we are going to do, let's say, okay, so let's just look at our type definition just so we can see how the data should look like. So we'll do an ID of 1, and we'll do a string of 1. And then we're also going to do an image of tiger. Image of tiger. And then let's look at our type definition again. We're missing category and slug. So for the category, it's going to be cats. Category, it's going to be cats. And then for the slug, it's also going to be cats. All right, so for the slug, it's also, for the slug, it's also going to be cats. So now we can just simply copy paste this 4 times. And the reason why we're doing that is because, well, we have 4 type definitions. So we can just, I guess, let's tabulate this a little bit better so it looks decent. It looks terrible. Let's fix the tabulations on this. All right. Don't mind this, guys. This is just a little bit of fixing just so I don't go crazy. There we go. Okay. So now let's just fix up the data. So the IDs are going to be different. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then for this, well, we have a snake. So over here is an image of a snake. The category is reptiles. Did I spell that correctly? And I did not. Nope. Reptiles. And then the slug is also reptiles. And then over here we got ocean creatures. So if you want to buy a stingray, again, Animazon, what it does is it just puts it in one of those prime boxes and it hands it to you. So we got ocean creatures, and then our slug will be ocean creatures, but just without the space, we'll just do a dash instead. And then lastly, we got mammals. And then over here, we'll just say mammals similarly. And over here, we have the donkey for the image. And over here, we have a stingray for an image. Okay, so that is that. So now what we can do is we can actually export default this. So we can say categories. And then we can go over here, we can export it, and then we can actually resolve this over here. So we can say, well, we want to resolve this categories with the category data right over here. So now we can go ahead we can go back to our playground. Let's do a quick refresh. Now we can do categories, and then we can just simply ask for the category things that we want. So let's say we want the category, we want the ID, let's say we also want the image. We execute this, and there we go. And that's pretty much all that we need to basically render this over here. So right here, we're just rendering all of the categories. So there we go. Now maybe sometimes in certain situations, we might have like 1,000 categories, and maybe you just want to show 4 categories of those 1,000. So we can probably add some actually additional logic here. Maybe we can add some logic about, you know, finding the most popular categories or whatever, but that would simply go inside of the resolver. In this case, we're only going to have 4 categories, but again, this is something that we can add and modify a little bit later. This crash course is mainly just to get you kind of introduced to GraphQL and really understand these concepts. If you have a good understanding of like a RESTful API, this is essentially what would go on into like the routes themselves, so you can kind of modify them as you go. All right, so that is that. But now once we click on a particular category, we need to basically fetch one specific category. And we've done this already, right? So we've done this already. So what we did was, when we needed one particular animal, well, we used arguments. So essentially now what we can do is we can do the same exact thing. So over here we can do category, and then we can say that this category is going to take in an argument that is a string, the name of slug, and it's going to return a single category. And this could be nullable because maybe you provide us with an invalid string. And so over here, what we can do is we can add another resolver. So we can do something like category. And so this category is going to essentially have those arguments. Again, parent args and context. We'll talk about the other two right now, but we should know what args does, the middle one. So now what we can say is, okay, well, we want to find the category. So we're going to iterate through categories. And we're going to find the category essentially where that particular slug is equal to the args.slug that we provide. And then over here, let's not forget our return, because that's something that we have to do. And then we could just simply return the category. Now for simplicities, we don't really have to store this in a particular variable. If we want to do additional logic, then maybe we do have to, but in a simplicity's case, we could just do this. We could just return whatever object that is returned. We don't have to store it in a variable and then return that variable, but for our case, we'll just leave it as such. All right, so now we can save this. And now we should be able to query for a specific category. So if I were to go ahead and do category, we should now see slug. This is what I love about GraphQL, is it's self-documenting. You can always see them over here. You can see kind of the documentations that you can basically kind of have. This is the schema, and you can actually look at the docs. So let's say you want to go for category. It tells you that, okay, this requires an argument that is a string, and these are the things that you get back. So it's self-documenting, which is pretty cool. All right, so slug, and let's just say mammals. And then let's say we want the category. We should get back, well, we get back null for some reason. Let's see why that is. Let's see. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually just console.log just to see why this is happening pretty much again, even though I thought I followed all the rules. I'm gonna console.log the categories.slug, and I'm gonna also console.log the args.slug. So now if we save this and we execute this, we still get null, but now we get undefined. And the reason for this is, well, this should be category, not categories. So let's execute this again. And now we get cat. Okay, so the reason for this is, look at that. I have mammal over here as the slug, and I'm gonna actually call this mammals. That was kind of my mistake. So now if we execute this, there we go. We get what we need. There we go. So I just kind of misspelled the slug. So there we go. So now we can simply return this. So now we are pretty much done this. However, again, a category must be linked to multiple animals. So there is actually some sort of a relationship here. Again, if I click on a particular category, we'll get prompted to this page over here that shows all of the animals that are associated to a particular category. And each category is linked to a particular, or each animal is linked to a particular category. And so this is actually a very important concept in GraphQL, and it involves relationships between entities. And we're gonna actually discuss that in the next section. So now it is time to discuss GraphQL relationships. And what do I mean by GraphQL relationships? Well, I've discussed this before. When you click on a particular category, what it does is it moves us to this page and it shows all of the animals that belong to that particular category. So there seems to be a relationship between many animal entities with one particular category entity. And that is exactly what the relationship is. Let's actually look at a quick diagram to kind of explain this. So over here we have a category, whether it's mammals, fish, or whatever, and this is associated with multiple animals. So over here, from the category standpoint, we have a one-to-many relationship. From the animal standpoint, we have a many-to-one relationship. So if you come from a SQL background, this kind of makes sense, but this also really makes sense from a GraphQL standpoint, and we have to somehow model this inside of our schema. So how do we go about doing this? Well, again, in our application, we have one category that can belong to multiple animals, and only an animal can only belong to one category. In more complicated relationships, maybe we can have multiple categories and an animal can actually belong to multiple categories. In that case, we actually have a many-to-many relationship, but for the sake of simplicity, one animal can only belong to one particular category, whereas a category can house multiple animals. So again, this is the relationship that we have, and this is the relationship that we actually have to expose inside of our schema. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, inside of the category, what we can say is, well, each category has multiple animals. So we can say, well, okay, so we have animals, and this should be an array of this type over here. So we can actually add that type right in, we can make it all non-nullable, and that way we're saying that, okay, a category can have multiple animals. Whereas over here with the animal, we can actually say that an animal can have one category by saying that, okay, this is the field category, and then we can say that it has only one category, and it is not an array of categories. So there we go. That is pretty much it. However, at this point, there's really no way of kind of modeling this in our data. For instance, when we go ahead and we want to, let's say, refresh this, we can actually go ahead and we can say we want to query for, let's say, categories. And then we want basically, let's say, the category itself. And then we want the animals. So the animals. Now with the animals, this is not a scalar type. So we actually have to define the things that we need from the animals. So we can say, let's say we want the title or whatever, the stock or the slug or whatever. But when we execute this, you can see here that, well, we get null in this case. And the reason for this is because, well, we don't have that data inside of our resolvers. Now what we could do is we could simply go to our data and simply go to basically all of our categories and add animals in there as well. So we can add an array of objects. So we can simply do this. Let's say we want to add this right here. So let's put a comma in, and let's just add this in right here. So we can add this kind of array of objects, and there we go. So now let's say we want to query for, let's actually query for just one particular category. So we can query for the category of cats. And let's say we want, let's say, the category itself, and we also want the animals associated with it. And let's say we want the slug, the title, and the image. And once we execute this, we get null for some reason, which is kind of awkward. I wasn't expecting that. Cannot read null for animal categories, even though I have animals right here defined. Oh, that's because I didn't save it. All right, let's save it. And now there we go. Okay, so there we go. Now for some reason this well, I mean, I guess I just pasted the first thing that I had in mind, but obviously a cat, well, donkey is not going to be in the cat category. But there we go. We could do this, but this is not too great. There's actually a better way of modeling this. So let's actually go ahead and let's get rid of this category. There we go. Let's get rid of animals. And there's actually a better way of kind of modeling this right over here. So what we can do instead is we can actually use this unique identifier and basically attach it to each particular animal. And we actually done this already when we copied and pasted. So let's say, for mammals, which is ID of 4, we want to basically iterate through every single animal and have a field called category, and we want to basically link that particular ID to whatever the category that this animal belongs to. For instance, a lion belongs to the cat category, so over here the category is going to be 1, and then over in the category section, well, this ID is 1 for the cats. And then similarly, once we go to maybe the salamander, well, this is going to belong to category number 2, and that is of ID 2, which is reptiles. And we can go on and so on and so on. Now, how do we actually go about, okay, now we have some sort of a relationship, but how do we actually go about resolving this relationship into actual data? Well, this is actually where more resolvers come into place. So essentially what we are doing here, and let's look at this right here, for instance. So over here, we're saying that within this type, we have animals that returns a bunch of animal. And what we could do at this point is we can essentially add a resolver. So we can add a resolver for the particular categories that essentially resolves this type right over here, this animal's type, what this is supposed to return. Again, it's supposed to return an array of animals. So what we can do is we can add a resolver for the category that basically tells us or returns back what is supposed to be returned for this animal query right over here. So what we can do is in here we have a query resolver. Well, we can add another resolver called the category resolver. And this category resolver will contain animals. And essentially, it's going to be a function that resolves basically the data that we expect to get, an array of animals. So how do we basically figure this out? Well, this is where we are going to be using the parent. So let's actually kind of console.log the parent for a second. So let's actually console.log the parent, and let's go ahead and let's execute this particular query. So we're going to execute this query, and then we get some sort of an error, which is fine. But you can see here that we get this object back. And so this object is essentially the parent. And what this parent is symbolizing is essentially the category itself. So the category that we are trying to execute. So over here, the category of cats. So you can see here that this is cats. So essentially from this, what we can do is we can say, okay, we can get this ID. So we can say, we can get this ID, and then we can basically iterate through all of the animals array and return all the animals where the ID is equal to, or where the category rather of those animals is equal to the ID right over here. So again, remember, we will iterate basically through all of these animals and we'll check, okay, if the category is equal to the parent's ID, then we are going to return that particular object inside of an array. Now to do this in JavaScript, what we can do is we can do the filter method. So we can do something like return animals.filter, and we can do animal, and we're only going to return if animal.category, so animal.category is equal to, the parent.id. And so let's actually go ahead and let's actually save this. Now remember, I completely got rid of the relationship right over here in the category section. So there's really nothing about animals, but now because of our resolver, we can actually go back, execute this, and it works perfectly fine. And it's actually going to work perfectly fine for categories as well. So now we can just basically ask for all of the animals for each particular category. Let's also figure out what the category is. So we can say, maybe we want the title, and now we can execute this, and there we go. That is incredible to me. All right, so that is pretty much this. However, now we have to do it in the other way. Now, basically, we want to query for a particular category when we're querying for an animal. For instance, if we are over here right now, when we're looking for a category, maybe we want to figure out what category this animal is in. When we execute this query, it doesn't work because, well, we haven't set up the logic yet. Now, how do we set up the logic? Well, what we can do again is add another resolver. So we need a resolver that basically resolves this right over here, because this is not returning a scalar type, it's actually returning another type right over here involved with categories. So we need an animal resolver that's going to resolve this category right over here. So let's go about doing that right now. So let's add a animal resolver, and it is going to resolve the category. Similarly, we're going to have parent, args, and then context. So far we know what parent is, we know what args, we still don't know what context is. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's quickly console.log the parent. And now let's actually execute this. And we actually are going to see, okay, once I save this, we're actually going to execute this. Now we're going to see a bunch of things going on right over here. So you can see that we see almost every single parent, and that's because we are basically executing it for every single animal right over here. Now if we execute it for one particular animal, we'll only see one, but the parent is basically going to be for every single animal that we iterate over, because we're iterating through every single one. So now we can say basically, okay, well, we are looking only for one category. So we can basically say, well, categories.find, and then the category, and we can just say, well, we want to return the category dot ID, where the parent dot category. So remember, the parent is housing this category right over here. So essentially, we want to return the category where the category ID is equal to that parent.category. So now we can go ahead and save this. And if we execute this, there we go. There we go. So we actually figured out how we can do this really, really well, and we can do these relationships with different types of resolvers. Remember, resolvers are things that resolve actual data. So over here, we're saying that an animal or a category can return this animals field, which is essentially an array of animals. Well, we're going to need a category resolver that tells us how, what data we're actually going to be returning back. So I hope that makes sense. In the next section, we're actually going to do a little bit of cleanup, just so we can actually clean up this particular file over here, because it is getting a little bit messy. Okay, so now it is time to organize this index.js a little bit more. And what I mean by that is we should probably actually have the schema in its own separate file and the resolvers in their own separate files as well. And this is just going to clean out the index.js as much as possible and can kind of separate all of the concerns into different files. So let us begin with the schema, or the type definitions. Now to do this, all we really have to do is create a schema.js, and then simply go ahead and just cut this right over here. So we can just cut it and just paste it in there, and then we can just do a module.export of schema, or of type definitions. And there we go. That is pretty much that. And now all we have to do over here is basically simply import the type definitions, or require in the type definitions from basically that file from the schema file. So now if we save this, well, something has failed, and let's see why. Well, the reason because, well, GQL is not defined, and the reason for that is, well, we actually have to go ahead and import it in over here as well. Because in this file, in the schema file, this wasn't defined. But now if we import it in and we get rid of the GraphQL Apollo or Apollo server, you can see here now everything is defined. We can actually get rid of the GQL on this import right over here. So if we save that, okay, there we go. We have really minified our index.js, and we actually separated our schema over here, which is ideal. Now for resolvers, it is best practice to actually have a folder called resolvers. So we can go ahead and create a folder called resolvers, and then we can have each individual resolver inside of this folder. So we can go ahead and create a query.js, and in here what we can do is simply just copy basically our query, and then we can just say that, hey, const query is equal to this particular object right over here. And that is pretty much this. Similarly, all we have to do at the very end is, let's actually go back over here. We're missing a curly braces, so let's go there. And all we have to do is a module.exports and just export that query. Now we can do the exact same thing with all of the other ones. Like, oh, I guess I was missing some things for the query as well. So I was missing the categories. Let's add those in there. Cool. Now we can add another resolver called category and another resolver called animal. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do category.js. And similarly over here, we're just gonna copy this. And then we're just gonna do a const category, and that's gonna be equal to this particular object. Let's get rid of this and let's get rid of that. And there we go. We have our one function that resolves the animal right over here. Okay, cool. So that does that. So that's the category. So let's go ahead and do a module.exports, and then we are going to export the category. And there we go. Let's save that. There we go. That is done. Last one is the animal resolver. So let's do animal.js. We're going to do const animal, and that's going to be equal to some sort of object. And this object, we're going to export it out eventually. So let's do animal. And let's go into our index.js, and then we can simply just, let's just paste this in right over here. The category, you can just simply paste everything we have in there. And then that is pretty much that. Okay, so that is done. Now what we can do is we can actually import those into our resolvers. So we can actually get rid of this whole thing right here. We can actually get rid of that. Let's comment it out for now. We'll get rid of it later. And then we can just start doing some imports. So we can import query, and we'll import query, and we'll require in from the resolvers. Then we want the query. And we can do the same thing for the animal and the category. Animal, animal, and then category, category, and then slash category right over here. All right, terrific. So now what we can do is inside of our type definitions, what we can do is we can say that, well, this resolver is going to be an object, and it's going to contain query, it's going to contain animal, and it's also going to contain the category. So let's write that down, category. There we go. So if we save this, everything should be working perfectly. Now we can delete these resolvers. And there we go. We have completely simplified our application. We have really separated all of our concerns. So this is a best practice. We definitely don't want to do everything inside of this particular index.js file. We want to be able to spread them out. All right, awesome. So I'll see you guys in the next section. So it seems as though everything is fine at the moment. Our refactor seems to have worked perfectly fine. However, there is still a little bit of an error. Let's actually go ahead and showcase this error by making a simple query. Let's query for a particular animal. We're going to query for the animal where the slug is equal to lion, and then we are going to get the title. And if we execute this, we actually get an error message saying that animals is not defined. And this is coming from the resolvers. So actually when we go to our query resolver and we go over here, this animal is this basically animal query is relying on the animals data. And that was basically imported before inside of the index.js. And that was perfectly fine when our files were in the index.js, but however, this is not going to work when we exported it out. So what we can do actually is just simply, well, import everything in. So we can essentially, what we can do is for each resolver, we can basically import everything in just so everything can work perfectly fine again. So let's go ahead and do that. We can just import all of our data in for each resolver. But as you can imagine, this can get a little bit tedious. And this is not going to work because, well, the path is incorrect. So let's go to the correct path. So it's /p. So let's go here, and let's go here. And there we go. Now everything works. If I execute this, this works perfectly fine. However, you know, with bigger applications, we're going to have multiple resolvers, and we're not going to really want to just import in or require in all of the data that we require. So instead, what we are going to want to do is use something known as the context. And this is where this context right here is going to play a huge role. So essentially, let's actually go ahead and let us get rid of these. And so let's get rid of these for now. And essentially now what we're gonna do is the context is basically kind of a centralized store, and we can put things in that store, and then every single resolver inside of our application will have access to whatever we put inside of that context. So if we want, what we could do is we can add these, 3 pieces of data inside of our context, and then our resolver will simply basically use the context right over here to get access to either the animals, the categories, or the main cards. And that is great because now we can get access to these data for each resolver, and we don't have to actually require it in to the file directly. Now, how do we do this? Well, this is very easy. All we have to do is go right over here, right below resolvers, and we can just say context. And you can see here context, and then this is going to be an object, and then inside of this we can see all of the things that we want to add. So we want to add animals, categories, or animals and categories. For simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out, and I'm just simply going to add something like hello my friend. That's all I am going to add. I'm going to add hello my friend, and this is going to be a message. All right, so this is what I'm going to add. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this exact same query, but then I'm going to go to my query over here, and I'm going to just quickly console.log the context. And let's go ahead and do this. Now this is going to fail because animals is not defined, but once we go right over here, well, I'm in the wrong one. It should be in animal rather than category. So let's console.log this again. So let's go ahead and execute this, and there we go. You actually see that this message is there. So now you can see that we can actually extract this. Now we can actually extract this even more, being that this is an object, we can actually kind of destructure this out as message. And so now we can say message, and if we execute this again, we see hello my friend. So similarly, now all we have to do is just simply add these objects over here, and we are pretty much set and done. So now what we can do over here in the context, let's go back to the context, you can basically say, well, we want to get out animals, we want to get out, let's say, categories. We don't need the main cards for this. So now we can do that. And similarly for the or we don't even need the categories for this. We just need animals. So we can just say, okay, we just want animals. Over here, well, we need the categories, so we can say, well, we can get the categories from this. Now, if we execute this, it works perfectly fine because we put everything inside of our context. Now let's go ahead in the animals. So what can we use from the animals over here? We need the categories. So we can save that. And then over here we need the animals data. And so we can do this. And this is typically actually used with when you're using either an ODM or an ORM. You can basically put all the models in here, and then you can make like some sort of a request. For instance, if you're using like Mongoose, you can put like the user in here, or I guess in this particular case, it would be an animal. And then you would do like an animal.find or whatever. So you would just kind of store that in the context. Well, now let's go back to what we had before. All right, so that is the context. And with that right there, we are pretty much done. Our application should be working fine with this refactor. There we go. That is the context. And we've pretty much covered what these three things are doing over here. So the last thing that we have to be able to do in our GraphQL API is manipulate our data. So at this moment, this is our data, but we might need to actually add more animals in, for instance. So right now we can look at basically this over here. We might want to be able to add animals in. We might want to be able to update animals. We might want to add, other main cards or other categories. You need to be able to manipulate our data. So we need to be, when I mean manipulate, is basically we might want to insert a record, we might want to update a record, or we might want to delete a record. So in this section, we are just going to worry about inserting a record. Let's say we want to insert a new animal into our website, because right now all we have is what? We have 8. Let's say we want to add another one. So let's go about doing that right now. Well, to do this, we actually have to do a mutation. So there's two types of things that we can do in a GraphQL. We can actually do a query, which we've been doing thus far. We can do a mutation, which is basically a way for us to update data, update, delete data, whatever. And we actually can do another thing, which is called a subscription, which is just a little bit more advanced, and I'm not going to get to it in this crash course. So let's actually just talk about mutations, which allow us to update our data. So to do this, what we'd have to do is we would have to go to our schema and define basically how our mutation is going to look. Because right now, once we do a mutation, well, we have literally no options in here. And when we go to docs, you can see it's all queries and no mutations. So we have to say that we want to kind of define how our mutations are going to look like. So we can say type mutation, and this is a special keyword indicating to GraphQL that this is going to be a mutation. Again, updating data in some sort of way, whether it's actually just changing something, inserting something, or deleting something. And so we can say maybe something like add animal. And then this, let's say, is ultimately after we add the animal, we can return that particular animal itself, and we can maybe do a bang saying that we always will return this animal. Actually, you know what? Let's just say that we can either return this animal or we return null if there's something goes wrong inside of our application. So if we actually go ahead and save this, now when we refresh, and we actually look at the docs, we can see now that we have a mutation. And when we do add animal, well, there we go. We have a add animal mutation. Now we need a resolver for us to kind of, resolve this right over here. So to do this, we are going to add a mutation resolver. So let's actually get rid of all of these. Let's get rid of that. And let's go over here and let's add a mutation resolver. So a mutation.js. And so this is going to be const mutation. And over here, this is going to be add animal. We want to resolve this. And then over here, we're going to have parent, args, and then we're going to have the context. And then this should be an arrow function. There we go. And then we can just do a module.export, and then we can essentially export out, the mutation itself. And so in here, we can simply just copy that and just change this to mutation. And similarly over here, we can change this to mutation. And now what we can do is, we can put mutation right over here as a resolver. So we can do mutation. And let's put a comma in just to make sure everything works fine. Okay, so now basically what we have to do is we have to create an animal. Now remember, let's look at the animal schema. An animal basically kind of requires all these fields. So let's actually paste it in here just so we can see all the fields that we require. Well, okay, so let's actually go ahead and ask the user for some of these fields, like the image, the title. Let's do like the ratings and things of that nature. So let's go ahead and ask the users for these things. Now, are we going to ask the user for a particular ID? Probably not. We're actually going to somehow auto-generate an ID inside of our application. We don't want the user to create an ID for us because, well, the user is not going to know what is unique across all the records. We want to basically be able to create that. So we're not going to ask the user for an ID, but then we're going to ask them for pretty much everything else. We're going to ask them for the image, the title, the rating, the price, the description, and everything else, basically. So how do we do that? Well, in our schema, we can simply go over to over here and just simply ask for, well, literally everything. So we can just pretty much copy all this, and we can say that, hey, we require all these things right over here. And this category itself is going to be a string rather than a category. Later on in the query, it's going to resolve itself. So essentially here we're saying that, okay, well, we need you, if you want to basically do this mutation, we need an image, we need a title, you can provide us with a rating if you want, we need a price, we need a little bit of descriptions, and we need a slug, we need some stock, and we need, and you can provide us with on sale, and let's say we absolutely do need a category. So there we go. We can actually go ahead and save this. Everything should be working fine. And now when we refresh this, now we can actually see all of the arguments that we need to provide. So we can basically provide image and blah, blah, blah. So let's actually go ahead and let's go over here and let's basically extract out everything that we need. So essentially, remember, the args themselves are going to contain everything that we need. So let's just say, let's just extract it out using a little bit of destructuring. So let's destructure this out. And let's say we are going to get all these things. Where are they? All these things right over here. I'm just going to quickly copy and paste them. And then we can, let's do a comma, 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 comma. So these are all the things that we're going to extract from the arguments. So for instance, now we can do like a console.log of, let's say, the image. And let's go ahead and provide some sort of image. In fact, we're going to actually have to provide a bunch of things. So maybe we can actually do a copy and paste of this as well. And then let's just add a bunch of things in there. So a title, a rating that is a float, let's add a comma here, a price that is, let's say, oh, this is also has to be a string, and then this is going to be an array of strings. I'm just doing a bunch of gibberish in here. Let's do a slug of alligator. Let's do a stock of 2 or 22, sure. And then on sale of true, and then a category of, let's say, 2. So once we execute this, it is going to fail because we're missing some parentheses. So let's go ahead and let's add some parentheses. And then over here, we have to basically specify what we want because we basically say that we're going to get back a animal. So now we can execute this. We get back null, but you can see in our server, nothing happens because I always forget to save. Let's execute this again. You can see here that we actually get back the animal or the image itself. So we actually can get back these arguments. So now what we can do is we can just basically construct the new animal. So let new animal equal to all of this right over here. And then we also need the ID. Now the ID, we're actually going to have to kind of generate ourselves. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to install a package that kind of generates IDs for us. And this package is called UUID. So go to the same directory, that same server directory, in the start and then in the server, and then do a npm install UUID. And so this is just allow us to kind of add a random ID that is going to be pretty much unique across everything. So let's go ahead and let's do const is equal to require, and then we'll do UUID. And now over here, what we can do is, I believe it's going to be called v4. I hope this works. Sometimes I always mess this up, but you can say now that the ID is called v4. v4 is just a certain version of the UUID. Don't worry, all you have to know is that this function is going to generate kind of a random string. So there we go. We have created our new animal. So let's go ahead and console.log this. And let's execute this again. All right, so now once we go back to our server, you can see that we get this new animal with this new random ID. So now all we really have to do is basically access the context over here, which is the animals. And essentially now all we have to do is basically push that new animals into this animal database. So we can say animals.push new animal. Animal.push new animal, and then after we push it, so at this point we basically pushed it into it, and then we can basically return the new animal because we basically promised that, hey, that's exactly what we are going to get back. So we can return back the new animal. So there we go. That is pretty much that. So let's go ahead and let's execute this. Let's change this to, let's say, I don't know, well, I guess I'm using alligator, so let's change this to alligator. And over here also alligator. So let's actually go ahead and execute this. And there we go. So now we can see that we actually get back this description, and it seems like everything is working fine. But now when we actually go ahead and make a query for all animals, and let's ask for specifically the, let's specifically ask for the image, because the image is going to contain basically what that animal is. Now remember, before we didn't have anything regarding an alligator, but now once we execute this, it says here animals is not defined for some reason. Animals is not defined. I wonder why that is. Let's see. Let's go to query over here, and it's saying that animals is not defined. Oh, and the reason for this is because, well, we have to add parents, args, and animals in here as well. I actually forgot about that. We have to do the same exact thing inside of this right here, but for categories. So now if we execute this, the only issue now is that we restarted our server completely. So let's actually go back and let's add this mutation. So let's go back and let's add this mutation. So, and let's ask for the image back. So we can go ahead and we basically added this. And now once we go ahead and go for the animals, not the animal, animals, and let's say we want the image, and we execute this, you can see here that now alligator is actually a part of our database. Now using this mutation, we were able to add another animal. And that right there is the power of mutations. So we're going to be doing one more mutation, which is basically allow us the ability to delete a particular entity in our database. Later on, maybe for your sake, maybe you can think of a way to actually update specific information, but I'm not going to go into that level because again, once you can figure out how to add and delete and work with mutations, you can probably really customize it to whatever it is that you want. So let's do that in the next section. So the next mutation that we are going to write is going to give our users the ability to delete certain animals inside of our database. For instance, let's say they wanted to, well, delete the gorilla. Well, we want to give them that ability. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So to do that, what we have to do is we have to define our new mutation type right over here. So we can say that a new mutation, what we could have is something like remove animal. And for the arguments, we can say that, well, we can either use the slug itself or an ID. I say we use an ID. And essentially, again, the argument is going to be used so we can identify what particular animal object that you want to delete, and then we can go ahead and delete that. And let's say that, well, we will return the animal itself that you want to delete. Actually, you know what? There's actually no point of returning the animal itself. Let's just return a Boolean indicating true or false if the thing was successful. So let's go ahead and let's do this. And let's actually add an exclamation mark over here. So now inside of our mutation, what we can do is we can basically do remove animal. And over here we can have parent, the args. The args is going to basically contain the ID, and then the context, which is going to contain the animals. And this animals is actually what we are going to be updating. So let's go ahead and let's update that. So now what we want to do is we essentially want to find the index where this animal object that we want to delete exists. And then what we want to do is we want to basically get this animals array and splice out the object at that particular index. So for example, let's actually go over here. Let's say we are trying to delete the horse, for instance. Well, we want to find the index where this horse object exists. In this case, it would be, let's say, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this would be the fourth index. And then we can use the splice method to splice out a particular element at that index. So we would just splice this out completely. And so this is what we're going to do. Now to find the index, we essentially what we would have to do is iterate through every single element and identify the ID that corresponds to the ID that was provided to us in our arguments. So we can do something like this. Let index equal to we can do animals dot find index. So this is an actual method, and then over here animal, and then we can do something like return animal dot ID is equal to the ID that was provided. So the first thing that passes this condition is going to get that index and basically put it inside of this value right over here. And then later on, what we can do simply is something like this. We can just do animals dot splice, and we want to splice the object at this particular index, and we only want to splice one object. So essentially, this is saying, okay, well, what from where do you want me to start the splicing? And then the second is basically saying, okay, how many elements do you want me to delete after that initial start? So if I say 2, then we delete the first one and the second one. But if I say 1, I say, okay, just delete that first one. So that's why we say 1, because we only want to delete that one. And in this case, we're always going to get some sort of successful response. So we're just going to do something like return true. So let us go ahead and let's try this out. So let's go and do a mutation. Let's refresh this. We'll do a mutation. We're going to do remove animal. Actually, before we do this, let's go make a query just to see what animals that we want to delete. So let's do animals, and let's do image, and let's do ID. Let's say we want to delete the poor gorilla. So we would just pass in this ID over here, the ID of 4. So now we can do a mutation, and then we can say remove animal and this ID of 4. And simply, well, we return back true. So we can just execute this. And there we go, we get true back. And now when we make the exact same query, we actually don't see the gorilla anymore. It's completely gone because we deleted it. And that right there is the power of mutations. I encourage you guys to continue playing around with them and maybe figuring out how we can update certain data. It really works the same exact way. Maybe for updating data, what we would have is something like this. We would have a, update animal. And so the first thing that we would need is we would need some sort of unique identifier to identify what object that we're trying to update. So ID. And then what we would say is, well, okay, so the next step is we need you to provide us with the things that you want us to update us with. So let's say they want to update the description or the title or the rating. So essentially what we would have to do is we would have to basically pass all of these things in over here. So we would have to basically pass all of these things over here and basically make them non-nullable. And essentially what we would say is, okay, if we actually provided a particular value, then we are going to update that value. But if it isn't provided, then what we're going to want to do is we are going to essentially use the existing value. So that is kind of a little bit more complicated, but I highly encourage that you guys kind of look into it. I'm not going to do it just for the sake of this crash course. It is getting a little bit long. So there we go. And that is mutations, and that pretty much concludes our API. Now let's actually move on to the front end, and let's actually start kind of interacting with our API in the front end. So let's go about doing that. So we finally built our GraphQL API, but now what we want to do is we want to essentially be able to make queries to our API in the front end. So now, from now on, we're going to be dealing with the front end and interacting the front end with our server. So if you're not interested in working in the front end, well, you can pretty much call it a day. You've learned a lot of GraphQL and you can just work on the server side and just let somebody else handle the client side. But if you're interested in learning the client side as well and how the client interacts with our GraphQL server, then continue. So right now, if you go ahead and do an npm install on the client and you go ahead and run it, this is all we get. All the data is not present at the moment. And essentially, the way that we are going to connect our client to our API, our GraphQL server, is through Apollo client. Again, there's multiple ways we can do this, and we've actually discussed this a little bit before, but Apollo client, in my opinion, is one of the easiest and is the most popular approach of connecting your client to your server. And we've used Apollo server, so might as well use Apollo client as well. So let's actually go ahead and use Apollo client to connect our React application to our API. Now, if you're not familiar with React, that is okay. The approaches that we are going to take is going to be very, very similar with things like Vue or Angular or Nux or Next or anything of that nature. There's Apollo implementations for these things as well, or libraries that are very similar. And at the end of the day, again, everything maybe syntactically might be a little bit different, but overall it's going to follow the exact same concepts. So let's go ahead and let's read the documentation. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to install Apollo client, and we also have to install GraphQL. So let's copy this and let's go to our client. Let's quickly go right over here. Let's go right over here. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to stop our, or you know what, we don't have to stop our running server. All we can do is we can open up a new terminal and we can just cd into it. Let me just expand the size of this terminal. So I'm going to do cd into the starting directory and then into the client. And then what I am going to do is simply do a npm install of Apollo client and GraphQL. Now you can go ahead and do this. I actually already did this beforehand just to speed up the video. So once that's done, you can kind of continue. So let's look at the next steps. So the next step that we have to take is, well, we have to create the client. And essentially what this step is doing is it's basically saying, okay, well, okay, you want to connect it to a GraphQL API, but you have to tell us, well, which GraphQL API you want us connected to. So let's actually go ahead and do this. We're going to do this inside of the index.js in the source directory. So let's go over here. Let's open up the index.js. And then over here, what we're going to do, actually, you know what? We're not going to do it in the index.js. Let's do it in the app.js. And so if this is a little complicated to you, you don't understand what's going on, don't worry. If you're moving on with the client side, I do kind of expect that you know a little bit of one of the three frameworks, whether it's Vue, Angular, or React. If you know one of them, you should probably be able to follow along with the other one. So if you're familiar with Vue, you should be relatively familiar with what's going on with React, and similarly with Angular as well. So essentially we're going to go over here to the app.js, and we're going to do those imports. So we're going to import, what are we going to import? So we're going to import something from @Apollo client, and that something is going to be Apollo client, which is allow us to create our Apollo client. And I forgot what it was called. It was something about caching, in-memory cache. In-memory cache. And essentially now what we're going to do is we're going to create our client. So we're going to basically follow this step right over here. So we're going to go over here. We're going to say const client is equal to new Apollo client. So we're creating a new instance. The URI is going to be the URI of our server. In this case it is, actually, let me go ahead and quickly copy this. And let me paste this in here. There we go. I'm only just doing this for my services. But essentially what we're going to do now is the API itself is going to be this one right over here. So we can go ahead, and this is the API that we want to connect to. And then for caching, so essentially what GraphQL does is it supports caching. So once we make a request to our API, we don't have to make the same request again. What we would do is we would just simply cache that data in memory, and then we would basically get that data back. And this is essentially what this in-memory cache is doing, and that is completely identical to what is happening over here, except this is something that we have to instantiate, new in-memory cache. All right, there we go. So that is that. And now we have to tell all the components within our React application about this client. And this is where we would use the Apollo provider. And so over here, we want to connect essentially our client, our API, to this React application. And so we would use the Apollo provider component. So over here, we would say Apollo provider, and then we would basically wrap all of our components with the Apollo provider component. So we would go ahead and wrap all these components with the Apollo provider component, and as a prop we would pass in our client. So as the prop, the name is going to be client, we're going to be passed in the client that we have just created. And now we basically have access to all the data inside of our GraphQL API with just this one single endpoint. So let's go ahead and save this and let us see. So let's go ahead and save this, and now, okay, you can see that nothing has changed. But let's go ahead and actually render those cards that we saw with our hero. So let's go ahead right over to our components, and we're going to go to the main hero page. And essentially what we want to do is we want to render those cards. Remember those cards with the title? Let's actually take a look at how they would look like in the GraphQL playground. So the main cards, and we want the image, and we also want the title. So if we execute this, we see here that main cards is not defined, and this is an issue of our server. Let's quickly resolve this. This is probably a context issue. So let's see why that's happening. Over here in the query, we're saying that main cards is not defined, and that's because, well, we have to access it in our context. So let's do main cards. So now if we execute this, there we go. So essentially we basically want to render the cards with this information. So this image and this title. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So now we are in the main hero component, not the CSS, but the JS. And let's actually go ahead and do this. And essentially what's happening here is once we can get the data, you can basically put the data right over here, and it's going to iterate over that array of data, which is basically this over here, this right here, this array, and it's going to basically generate our cards. Currently, it's just an empty array. So let's go ahead and get this data. Now, how do we get this data? Well, we would get this data using a special hook. And this is why we need to use function-based components for this. We're going to use a special hook from Apollo client called useQuery. So use query, and you can see that there's multiple hooks, but we're going to get use query. And this essentially allows us to query our data. And now we also have to define the kind of GraphQL layout, this right here, basically the schema that we basically want. And so over here, we're also going to have to use GQL. So let's go ahead and basically let's create that schema right over here. So let's go make that query. So over here, we're going to do something like const, and essentially, you know, our cards data, we'll do cards data, and that is going to be equal to the query, and then this query is going to accept basically the structure that we want over here. And so this is going to be GraphQL with these tags right here, and then we can basically paste this in there if we want to. You can basically paste this query in there. So this is the query that we want to make. So there we go. Let's just improve the syntax a little bit more. And there we go. So there we have it. So let's actually go ahead and just console.log. So let's console.log the cards data. And so essentially what we're doing here, again, this is how we would do basically the exact same thing, but in our React side. We would just use this use query hook, and then we would wrap our query inside of this particular hook. So let's go ahead and we will save this, and then we will console.log the cards data. So let us go ahead and go to Animazon, and if we refresh, it seems like nothing is failing, which is great. Let's go to our console, and we can see that we get a bunch of objects. So let's look at the first object. You can see here that we have a bunch of things. We have something like data. Well, the data at the moment is undefined. And over here we have error. Error is also undefined. And then if we kind of continue looking, we see something like loading. And over here it says loading is true. And so the reason why the data is undefined is because it takes a little bit of time for us to fetch our data from our API. And therefore, we are currently in the loading state. We're not in an error state, we haven't hit that yet, and we haven't hit any data. We're just loading. So now, once we kind of go on over here, you can see, okay, we're still loading, so this is true. But then at the very end, well, you can see here that we're not loading anymore. We haven't hit an error, and there we go. We have our data. And that is exactly what we need. So over here, what we can do, instead of just saying card data, you can basically destructure out these important things: loading, error, and the data. And now what we can do now is, if we are in a loading state, we can say, well, if loading, we will return maybe some sort of spinner or whatever, indicating that we're still loading. In this case, I'm just going to have loading dot. So over here we have we're just loading. And then, you know, maybe if we hit some sort of error, we can say return, you know, some error happened. And so essentially, if we're loading, we're only going to return this over here. We're not going to return any of these other ones. If we hit an error, we're going to return this over here. And then if we are basically, we hit our data, then we basically hit this over here. Now remember how our data looks like. Our data, I hope this is clear. Let's zoom in a little bit. Zoom in some more. So you can see here, our data at this point contains the main cards. So essentially what we can do now, and the main cards is an array itself with the image and the title, because that's how we specified our data. So now what we can do is we can say here, instead of an array, an empty array, we can say data.main cards. And if we execute this, there we go. Okay, so this seems like it is working. All right, so one thing that I am missing is I don't have a key prop over here. And another thing that is odd is that the images don't seem to be rendering. Now let's go ahead and let's see why these images aren't rendering. So we got card.image. And so, okay, and the reason why the card.image is not rendering is because let's actually go ahead and console.log this again. So console.log the data. So the reason why the cards are not rendering is because I mistakenly just used img instead of the word image, as you can see right over here. So if you go ahead and change this to just image, you should see the images rendered. There we go, and we can add a key later on, but whatever. So that is basically the first step. Let's actually move on to the next step where we can actually render our other cards. So I'll see you guys in that section. Okay, so now let's move on and let's work on the other things. So like the categories and the cards themselves. Let's actually work on the animal cards first, because then those are the most visual. So let's go ahead and let's go about doing that. So to do this, what we have to do is we have to go to our landing page. And so if we go to the pages directory right over here, and then we go to the landing page, we can see here that we have our main hero, which is this over here. We have our category display, and then we have our cards display. And this cards display takes in a prop that contains basically an array of objects that contain all the information about our animals. In this case, right now, it is just an empty array. So we have to actually fix that at the moment. So let's go ahead and let's make a request to our client, and let's basically ask for specific data. Now in the last section we used basically, let's go back to what we had before. I believe this was in the main hero. What we did was we actually appended the GraphQL schema right over here, our request, our query, inside of the use query. Best practice is actually to do something like this. We can do something outside of the function, such as like fetch, main cards, and we basically set that equal to this query right over here, and then we can basically go right there and just put in fetch main cards, and that just makes it a lot easier and better to visualize. So we can actually go ahead and we can see that this results in the exact same thing. So this is what we're going to do with our landing page. So let's go ahead and let's import in use query and GraphQL, or GQL, you know what I mean, from Apollo client. And over here, we're going to make a request to get basically the information that we need for our animal cards. Now remember, our animal cards contain a lot of different information. So over here, we have like the image, the ID, the stock, the rating, the whatever. And there's actually certain things that we don't need. For instance, we don't need the stock, we don't need the description, we do need the image for the card. So let's actually go ahead and select for the things that we need. So we do need, let's say we need the image, let's say we also need the ID, even though really nothing is visually displaying. We need the price, and we need the slug, and we need the image. So these are the things that we need. So this is the query that we are going to make, and that way we only get the data that we need. So let's go ahead. Oops, I always go the wrong way. So let's go ahead and let's say const fetch, or we could probably call this something like animals query. That's probably a better thing to call it. And then we can just do this. And then over here, we can basically say, well, give me the loading, the error, and the data from use query, and then of this particular query, the animals query. Now, I actually kind of brushed through this, and I didn't really describe this. I just realized that all this is typically in capitals. So this is just kind of a common convention. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is a common convention for a query or a mutation to be all in capitals, and just certain words to be separated by an underscore. So that's just a common convention, but it doesn't have to be this way. But again, common convention, so that's what I will do. So there we go. So now we get our data. So now what we can do is we can do something like, well, if it is loading, well, let's return, hey, we're still loading. Again, In a real application, we would probably have something more complex, maybe some cards that appear that they're loading or some sort of spinner. But for this, we're just going to do something like this. So if error, we're going to do a div. We're going to say error. And then, if we pass all these, then we're over here. And essentially now what we're going to do is we're going to say data dot animals. And essentially what this is going to be is that those array of animals. So now if we actually pass that in there, and now if we go to, let's actually go to the cards themselves. I believe the images are not going to work, and the reason why the images are not going to work is because I misnamed them over here. So let's rename them back to image. And there we go. So I believe now if we go to our component, we see our cards. However, we do seem like we're missing the title, and the reason why we're missing the title is, I think, because we're not asking for it. So let's go ahead and ask for the title. Now we'll get a little bit of a loading state, and there we go. Now we have our title, and we rendered these images. So now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing, but for the categories. Now in this section, if you go to our landing page, you can see here we have a category display. And this is basically not using any props, even though we could have potentially appended the category query right over here. We could have done something like category and just added it as a prop. For some reason, I decided not to do it that way. So I mean, this would be a perfect example of actually underfetching. And I think actually that might be a better approach. So I might actually refactor the way that we're doing things so we can actually pass this in as a prop, just because it is better. Actually, you know what? Let's just continue. But you can kind of think of it. We can have over here, we can actually append categories and have our query as well. So we don't have to have the results of actually underfetching all of our data. But for the sake of practice, let's actually go to the categories, not the categories page, but the categories display. And let's go ahead and let's do this thing all over again. So let's do import, use query, and then GraphQL, and then we're gonna get that from we're gonna get that from Apollo client. There we go. And so now what we're gonna do is we're going to define our query. So we're gonna say this query is the categories query, and so this is going to be equal to GraphQL, and this is going to be a query. And over here we're going to want the categories, and we also want from the categories the category itself, the image, and then the slug. So let's go ahead, and now over here, simply again, we're just gonna do, not the console.log, we're gonna do a const, and we're gonna do loading, error, and then we're gonna do data. And this is going to be use query, and we're just simply going to paste this right in there. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly paste these two error handlings right over here so I don't have to copy them out again. And then over here we can just say data dot categories. That's going to be the map, and then there we go again. Please keep in mind that we have to change it from image to images. So there we go, and there we go. So that is our landing page. Now one problem, when I go ahead and click, you can see here that I don't really have the data associated with our application. So let's actually go ahead and let's fix this right about now. Okay, so the next step is for when I click on a particular animal, I want to be able to see the details associated with that animal. Right now I get really no data other than maybe this right over here, but this is really just fixed into place. Later on we actually want to dynamically generate this data. So let's go about doing this right now. Now remember, if we want just one animal, we already have a query set out for this. Something like animal, and then we would provide the slug. So the slug would be something like, well, lion or whatever. And then we would ask for the specific data that we want back. So we have a query for this. And so what we can do is we can just simply copy this exact same query. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And so this, basically this right here is a separate page, as you can see by the route. Let's go to the route over here. As you can see, this is a separate page, and this is actually the animal page. So let's go to the animal page, and let's go ahead and let's make a request to basically get our data. So now we are going to do simply like we've done before. This is kind of getting a little boring, but this one is a little bit more interesting, and we'll see why actually. And then from Apollo client, let's just get rid of that extra space. And now what we want to do is we want to make a request. And so what kind of data do we expect to get back? Well, we expect to get back the image. So right now we don't have an image. And we also expect to get back the title, which is something that we don't have at the moment. So let's say title, let's say image. And let's say we also need, not the ID, sorry, the image. And let's say we also need the stock. So that's something that's very important. So the stock. And then we also need the description, because right now this is just generated statically. So let's say the description as well. And we also need the price over here. We need to display the price. And I think other than that, that is pretty much all that it is that we need. I don't think we need anything else at the moment. So we just need these things. So let's go ahead and we would execute this. And okay, great. So let's actually copy this and let's put it in over here. So let's do animal query. So the animal query. And then this is going to be equal to, well, GraphQL and then the query. However, there's a little bit of an issue here. Right now, this is always lion. We hard-coded lion. And this is not really the way that we want it in our application. We want to essentially pass in whatever this particular slug is right over here into our query in our application. Now we can actually go ahead and do this by first using some sort of React way of getting that slug. So over here, I get that slug with the use params hook. Essentially what this allows us to do is just to get the slug. Don't worry about it. But now what we have to do is we have to somehow pass it in to this query right over here. And this is actually not too difficult. To do this, what we would say is we would actually specify the word query, and then we would have parentheses. And then we would say that we are expecting a $, some sort of variable, and this variable is called slug. And we specify a variable in GraphQL with the $. So now we're saying $slug is what we are expecting to get somewhere inside of our query. And then this is expected to be a string, and this has to be a string. So once we get this variable, what we can do is we can actually place it over here. Okay, so this is cool, but how do we really pass in the variable inside of this query? Well, once we do our use query, remember we get loading, error, and data. We can basically define the query with the animal query, and then we can have a separate object that contains a bunch of other configuration. This object, one of the configurations is variables, which is a separate object of its own, and it's going to contain all the variables that we want to pass in. Now in this case, we want to pass in the slug variable, so we can say slug is equal to slug. Again, we're not going to pass in the $, but essentially what GraphQL is going to do is it's going to append the $, later on. So we're going to say slug is equal to slug, and that way whatever the slug is, we're going to be able to pass that in. But now because the key and the value are the same word, in JavaScript we can just simply do slug on its own, and that is exactly the same thing. So let's go ahead and just console.log this data, and let's see what goes on. So over here, I'm expecting data based on the chameleon. So let's go ahead and let's inspect this. And over here, we can see, let's refresh this once more. And there we go, we get some animal data. And this data is, well, a chameleon. This is all about the chameleon. Now if I go ahead and I do elephant, I get some data. And this data is, well, about the elephant. And there we go. That is exactly how we would do this kind of dynamically. So let's actually go ahead and let's just render our data in. So let's just do these conditional checks. You know, if error, if loading, then just return loading. And then if error, then return error. And now over here, if we pass all these things, then we can say basically data.title. So now we can actually see the title once we refresh. I don't know what's going on here. So, oh, sorry, it wouldn't be data.title. It would be data.animal.title. My bad. Data.animal.title. And now we see this. Over here, we can say data.animal.stock. So now we should be able to see the stock. There we go. Over here, what we can do is instead of dynamically or just like, you know, we can dynamically render this by having some sort of an array. So we can say data.animal.description. And then we can just say .map because this is an array. And we can say, actually, is this description or descriptions? Okay. It should be descriptions actually, but whatever. We can say, okay, for each description, we're going to map over it and we're going to return an li of that description. So now we can save that. Now if we refresh this, it should be exactly the same, but you can see it's rendering even though we don't have it. Few more things that we're missing. We're missing the price, so we can say data.animal.price. And there we should see a price right here. Cool. Absolute last thing is the image. Let's figure out where the image is. Let's figure out where the image tag is right here. Okay, so now we can just add a source of this would be animals, because this is, if you don't know what I'm doing here, we have an animals object that we imported. Let's go find this animals object. It's in our assets. So essentially here, I basically have a bunch of images, and I'm basically defaulting them, and I'm basically importing them over here. So now what we need to do is we basically need to say, well, I want, whatever image that I want, I basically say animals and then brackets whatever the name of the image that we want. So we can go ahead and do something like this if we want. If we wanted the lion, we would say lion, and there we go, we would get the lion. However, in this case, we actually don't want the lion. We want to dynamically put it in there. So it would be data.animal.image. Save it in there. We get our beautiful elephant. There we go. So that is that. That is terrific. And that works perfectly fine. And we're going to do something extremely similar with the categories section. So once we click on a category, we want to be able to see those categories. Highly encourage you guys to do this on your own, but if you want to kind of continue following along, I'm going to start doing it right now. So let's go to the category page. So this is the category page, and over here we are going to make another set of calls. So here we're going to do kind of the category query, and this query is going to look a little something like this. So let's go back to the playground. And it's going to look something like this. We're going to have, the category. We're going to specify the slug, let's say the mammals category. And then we're going to ask for the things that we want. So in this case, we want the ID, we want the category itself, to kind of explain what it is. Maybe we even want the slug. But one thing that we also want is all of the animals associated with that category so we can display the cards. So over here we can say animals, and then we can say, well, we want the ID, we want the title, we want the price, and we want the image. So we can go ahead and execute this, and yada yada yada, we get all of our data. So let's go ahead and let's just paste that query in right over here. Again, we want to be able to dynamically generate this. So we would just say query, and then we would say $slug, and this is going to be a string bang. And then over here, we're going to say that we're going to use this right now. Okay, cool. So now, same exact thing. You can do const. Did I import I didn't import it. One thing we can actually do, let's see if this works. The one thing that we can actually do is we can actually define use query. Actually, it didn't work, so might as well just import it then. Or import use query, and then GraphQL from, and then let's do this is, well, from @Apollo client. And now over here we can just do use query, and what we're going to do is we're going to do the category query, and then we're going to specify our variables like we've done before, and this is going to be the slug. Of course, we want the error, the data, and the loading. And let's see if I can just quickly copy and paste these things over here. You know, if this happens. So one thing that is important is we actually have to do this, and the reason why if we don't do this is, let's actually go ahead and let's try to actually render data in here. So data dot this is going to be data dot category, or sorry, this is going to be data dot category dot animals. This is rendering our animals. If we actually go ahead and execute this, and then we click on this, it ends up failing. And the reason for this is because, well, it's saying it cannot read property category if undefined. And at this point, data is undefined because, well, data is going to be undefined until we're able to actually resolve our query. And that's why we actually need this. So let's go ahead and let's put that in there. And then over here, we can put in the actual category. And if we refresh this, it shouldn't fail anymore. It is. So objects are not valid. I wonder why this is invalid. This should be not an object. Let's actually console.log our data just to see how it looks like. So let's console.log right over here. Just to see why this is not behaving the way that we want it to behave. So let's console.log, we see our categories, and so it seems like it's category and then animals right over here. So I'm a little confused as to why this isn't working actually. Data, because this is an array and not an object. So, I don't know, in my opinion, this seems like it's working. I might have to pause the video to see why this isn't. Okay, I'll pause the video to see why this isn't working. This should be data.category.category, and I think that's what really confused me. Remember, I went ahead and I did this again. Remember, if we actually go ahead and we console.log our data, this is category, and then over here we have another category right over here. So we were actually returning just category, and that's why it was failing, because we were returning a simple object. So there we go. We have built out our entire application. This is pretty much done. The last thing that I am going to add in this application that I didn't introduce is maybe a little bit of a form that allows us to add new entries in. And this will just kind of teach you how to actually use the mutations within React. So we're just going to really quickly do this. I'm actually kind of doing this on the fly. I haven't prepared it, but I thought it would be important to kind of talk about that. So that's what we're going to do in the next section. So the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to see how we can actually apply a mutation in the front end. And I was thinking about doing a form, but just to make things a lot easier and quick, let's just do a simple button that essentially inserts a particular piece of information into our data, a new animal into our database. So let's go about doing this. So what we want to do is we want to use some sort of mutation to add an animal over here. So essentially, well, we have a mutation for this. We have our add animal mutation, and let's say we want to add a real animal in here. So we want to add, an animal with basically an image of ostrich. So this is a real animal, and then we're going to say that the category is, or we're going to say belongs in the cat category, because we don't have a bird category at the moment. We'll say, what else do we need? We need a title. So let's do a title. This is a really cool ostrich. And then let's do a stock of like 13, a price that is going to be 32,000. I wonder if we're missing anything in the description. We're not going to have much of a description in here. Let's do a rating of 3.5, and then a slug of ostrich. So ostrich. And then, am I missing anything else? I believe that should be good. So if I actually go ahead and execute this, it says that I am missing something. So field, did you mean add animal? So field add animal of type must have a selection subfield. Do you have, oh, okay, that's fair. So let's say we want the ID itself, so we can execute this, and there we go. We executed this mutation. And now because we executed this mutation, if we refresh our React app, we actually should see this ostrich. And there we go. So that is basically the mutation, but now we want to be able to do it in the client side. So let's actually just quickly, down and dirty, just create some sort of button that allows us to insert ostriches into our animal array. So what we're going to do is we're simply just going to go to this landing page, and we're just going to create a button called add an ostrich. And so this is going to be down and dirty, but I just don't want to create multiple forms and really worry about the React side. Really, when we want to make mutations, maybe we would have some sort of form that gets data from the user and puts it in the mutation itself. But in this case, we're just going to do this, but it really is very similar to the way that we would do it with a form or anything of that nature. So let's go ahead and let's refresh this, and we have this button called add an ostrich right here in the bottom. So let's do a mutation. Now to do this, we would do something very similar. We would do over here, and we would say add animal mutation. And this is going to be GraphQL. And essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to copy this mutation and we're going to paste it in there. Now of course, we don't want to hard code these informations in because they could be different. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, we expect some variables. So for instance, we expect a variable that is a string. We also expect a category that is also a string. We expect a title that is a string. And then we expect a stock, which is an int. And then we expect a price that is a string. And then we expect, and this all, sorry, this by the way all should have $signs in them. So $sign, $sign. And then we expect a description, so $sign description, that is an array of strings. And then over here we expect a rating, $sign rating, that is a float. That is a float. This we don't have to have a bang in it. And then we also expect a slug that is a string. And then over here, all we would have to do is just simply say, instead of hard coding it in there, you can just say, well, we would use this. And then I'm just gonna have to quickly copy and paste everything in there. So let's do category. I don't know what would be faster, me typing it out or just copying and pasting. Let's do stock, and then price, and then description, and then $, rating, and lastly over here we can do the $, slug. Okay, so that is basically our mutation right over here. So now what we can do is we can actually use a new hook called use mutation. And so essentially over here we can basically set up this use mutation right over here. This is going to be set up a little bit differently. Instead of an object, we are going to use an array, and this is going to be equal to the use mutation, and we're going to pass in the add animal mutation. And over here, essentially what we are going to be doing is we're going to say, well, add animal. This is going to be the function that we want to call when we this is the function that we want to call when we go ahead and basically want to add some sort of a mutation. So let's go about doing this right now. So essentially when we click this over here, so let's have a on-click event. Essentially we want to execute a function. We want to basically execute a function that calls the add animal. And then over here we can just basically call it, but we can also provide variables. So we can say, well, we want to provide some variables, and what are these variables? Again, these variables can be dynamically generated from our client, but in this case, these variables are going to be exactly these guys right over here. So let's go ahead and let's paste in these variables, and this is exactly what our variables would look like. So that is pretty much it. That's how we can actually execute a mutation. So let's go and save this, and now let's refresh. So let's go and just refresh our server itself. So to do this, all we have to do is go to any file in our server and just save this again. And now once we go over here, we shouldn't see our ostrich anymore. So now when we click on add an ostrich, well, we can click on it and then we can refresh our page, and there we go. We have an ostrich. You can see that this works. Again, this could be completely dynamic. We can have a form, but for the sake of simplicities, this is what we are going to do. So again, we would just have some sort of query. We would follow pretty much the same steps where we define all of the things associated with this ostrich right over here. And then we would basically use the use mutation hook, and then we would call that hook with the variables associated with it. So there we go. We have learned a lot about GraphQL. I hope you guys have a great depth of knowledge. I hope you guys enjoyed the crash course. It was a pleasure making it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.